A lot of crazy solutions. In order for your LLMs to be able to ask for access to a file and then get the metadata from it and then make a decision. With 1 million tokens, each token being 4 to 8 characters, most code bases will comfortably fit in that window. And it's been a lot of fun using models like Gemini to just dump a ton of data, ask it to do something, and it can because it has all of the context right there. OpenAI's models have historically been limited at around 100,000 tokens. So this is a 10x jump, which is huge and fundamentally changes the things you can do with these models. But it's also part of why they're only in the API, because you shouldn't be pasting millions of tokens into a chat UI. I have a gripe with a lot of our users. Since these models are API only, if you do want to try them, you should check out T3 Chat. We're currently offering 4.1 Mini and Nano for free without having a paid subscription. And 4.1 is part of our $8 a month tier. Yes, $8 a month for access to all of these models, 1,500 messages a month with any of them other than the 2 expensive ones, which are Claude and Grok 3. Everything else isn't premium. Those 2, you'll get 150 messages a month. You get the idea. We've shilled T3 Chat enough. To celebrate the drop, I want to give out some free T3 Chat. So use the code 4.1 with dashes spelled out all caps when you check out for 1 month free. And don't do this if you're already a subscriber. If you cancel and resub, it won't work and just makes our numbers look bad. So it's only for new subs. Sorry. But if you haven't subbed yet, T3.chat, I think you'll be impressed. If you don't like it, you can just cancel. It's free anyways. We'll do that for the first 300 people who use the code. So if you get an error, I'm sorry. 300 people redeemed it ahead of you. We'll be back to actually test the models here in just a moment. 4.1 did really well on these other challenges too. It was like a 30% bump on the scale multi-challenge, which checks a bunch of different things. And it also killed it with the video context understanding benchmark, which is really useful, being able to parse a long video and find specific things in it. It's going to be a really powerful use case. I'm excited to see what people do with it. This is the chart that is most interesting. And not just because they screwed up when they first posted it. Let me find proof of that here. Originally, they put 4.0 Mini as the label in both places, which is pretty funny. They've since addressed it and fixed it. So now it says 4.0, like it always should have. Just thought that was funny. This puts 4.1 in an interesting spot. I would already personally consider 4.0 Mini to be like the lower tier of what I would accept for quality. So having something stupider than 4.0 Mini isn't particularly attractive to me. But having a model that is as cheap as it is very interesting, especially coming from OpenAI. This is my work browser. Sorry for the browser change. I want to go through all the prices quick in order to contextualize. So 4.1 is $2 per million tokens in and $8 per million tokens out, putting it a little bit cheaper than something like 4.0 while performing seemingly outright better. Really, really cool. It can't generate images or audio yet, but it can take in an image, which is very handy. What's more interesting here isn't the price of 4.1 though, although that is very interesting. It's 4.1 Mini, which is slightly more expensive than 4.0 Mini was, and 4.1 Nano, which is by far the cheapest model OpenAI has ever released. We use this little site I just built for checking model prices, modelprices.versell.app, by the way, if you're curious. Here we can see how these cheaper models all compare in price. You'll see that 4.1 Mini is a decent bit more expensive than 4.0 Mini, where 4.0 Mini was 15 cents in, 60 cents out. 4.1 Mini's 40 cents in, $1.60 out. So for a mini model, that's somewhat expensive, depending on what you think a mini model is, because 03 Mini is still the best model out there. It's technically a mini model, but it's not that expensive compared to a lot of these things, and it's still really, really good. Look, it's literally just barely higher here, but it's the best model ever made, and everything above this, for the most part, isn't really worth it unless you're doing specific stuff. So back to these prices, though, because Nano is priced identically to Gemini 2.0 Flash. Very, very interesting because as you guys probably know by now, Flash is one of my favorite models. The price to performance there is insane. And if we trust how OpenAI described the performance characteristics compared to their own models in that chart, because again, we don't have many third-party verified benchmarks just yet. I'm quite confused about 4.1 Nano simply because it's clear they're trying to make this a model that competes with 2.0 Flash. But 2.0 Flash is very smart, like smarter than V3. And if I add in the things that are going to ruin how this chart looks, the new 4.0 is quite a bit smarter, but still not that much more so in general than Gemini 2.0 Flash is. 4.0 is 50 points on this arbitrary average index that they make on artificial analysis. And Flash is 48.09. So they're in like spitting distance of each other, even though 4.0 is like 30x the price. 4.0 Mini is quite a bit stupider. If 4.1 Nano was smarter than 4.0 Mini, then it would make a lot of sense to compete with Flash. But right now, I would say of the new models, that's the one I wouldn't bother touching because even in their own diagrams, let me find it again quick. Here, they said 4.1 Nano with a fancy Apple-style chart with no labels. They said 4.1 Nano is dumber than 4.0 Mini. So it's exactly as expensive as Flash, but it's dumber than 4.0 Mini, which makes it way dumber than Gemini 2.0 Flash. I don't think Nano has a use case right now other than theoretically latency, but even there, it's kind of struggling. I use OpenRouter to compare latency numbers because they're using real production traffic and averaging it. Nano's latency is about 0.43 seconds, so it takes about that long before you start getting tokens back, and 136 to 137 tokens per second, compared to Gemini 2.0 Flash, not even the light version, just standard 2.0 Flash. Latency's within a spitting distance, throughput's higher. I don't get it. I'm confused what the role of this model is. It's not like it can output more stuff than they can with Flash. That seems to be about it, though. Yeah, this is why I'm getting confused. We go back to my pricing chart. This is what I made that website on, by the way. So here we see 2.0 Flash, 10 cents in, 40 cents out. 4.1 Nano, which is dumber, 10 cents in, 40 cents out. Flashlight is still the GOAT for its price, but again, it's so close to 2.0 Flash, hard for me to justify touching light. So I'm a bit confused about these Mini and Nano models. Mini makes sense. The price increase feels a bit weird. The only reason I would ever use 4.1 Mini instead of something else is if I really don't want reasoning and I want fast responses with access to the tools and things that OpenAI integrates with better. That's actually one of the important things that we need to talk about as we cover this, because there's a lot of things that models can be good and bad at. So obviously, one of the things that makes models good is their general intelligence. I would argue you could break this into multiple categories. There is knowledge. So how much stuff does it have that it trained against? This is what made 4.5 so smart, so to speak, is that it was trained on an insane amount of data. So it knows more about the world than almost any model before it did. It doesn't mean it's good enough, though. And the intelligence isn't just how much data does it have, but how well can it apply things. So that's how we have the data model trained on. Then we have the capabilities of that model. This would be stuff like reasoning, for example, allows the model to make smarter decisions based on the data that it has, but it doesn't know things it doesn't know. So like, when was the data cut off? If you ask it who won the Super Bowl in 2024, but it was only trained for 2023, it doesn't matter how good its reasoning is. It might be able to guess who won better, but a model that has more data will be more likely to answer the question correct, especially if the data is more up to date. You can't beat not having the data, but once you have the data, how smart can you be with it? 4.1 does not have as much data as 4.5 or anywhere near it. It is a more recent cutoff, and it doesn't have reasoning. So everything they've done in the general intelligence camp, so to speak, is just improvements in their inference layer, improvements in how they're building things and doing things. That million context window suggests they're doing things very differently with this model. So I'm excited to see what that looks like long term. So general intelligence. Then we have domain specific intelligence. This is things like how good is it at science? How good is it at math? How good is it at code? 4.1 is a huge leap in a handful of those, specifically math and more importantly, code. OpenAI has historically struggled with both of those categories. When I have a really hard technical problem to solve, O3 Mini can help me through it and think through these difficult things. But beyond those hard problems, it's not particularly great to work with. The combination of the reasoning, meaning you don't get an answer for quite a bit, as well as the lack of day-to-day knowledge with code, I feel like it has. Like, it's not going to be a good autocomplete or tab complete experience. It's not going to be as good at building UIs quickly. But if I have a really weird scroll container problem or some weird database management stuff I want help with, or I'm just talking with it about different architecture stuff, I found O3 Mini to be really, really good. But when it comes to just solving code in the day-to-day, not so much so. The winners historically for code been Claude, and not just Claude, the 3.5 re-release that happened late last year, that's 3.6 that we've since coined it. 3.5 has historically been the winner here. Anthropic's working super, super hard to win in code, and they have succeeded thus far. It's one of the reasons they can charge their premium, but there's one other reason they can charge their premium. This is one of the most important pieces I want to emphasize here. Tool calling. Tool calls are, at this point, essential to a model being smart. Tools are the general term for things we give the AI access to, and we do that by having certain text it can spit out that we will then process and do something with code with. An example of this would be checking the weather. So a user could ask, how should I dress today? And the AI would be able to call a tool that you built that will go check the weather in your area, get back a response, and then use that response as it generates its answer. Tool calls are huge, especially for things like giant code bases, because if you need to access certain files, you might need to find all files that reference this variable. And if you have a tool, like you would in something like Cursor, that allows the AI to ask where all the files that are relevant are, it will provide those files, and then it can do things to them. It has tools for updating files, it has tools for changing variables, tools for checking types, tools for reading errors, tools for all these types of things. The reason I bring this up is there's been one model that has dominated with tool calls. Claude won hard. Claude is the undisputed king of tool calling, and I would go as far as to say it's the reason they can justify their premium. If they weren't so far ahead with how good Claude is with tools, they would not be able to justify their price at all, and they would have already lost. But because Claude is good at tools and also is trained well on code, Anthropic's been leaning really, really hard in this developer-focused direction. Things like Claude Code is a great example of them really leaning into developers. 4.1 is OpenAI fighting back, because in these particular places, in code knowledge and math knowledge too, but more importantly, tool calling, 4.1 is killing it. One other note on tool calls before we go any further is that reasoning seems to hurt here. Reasoning makes a model more likely to generate the right answer, but reasoning also has an interesting side effect where it will talk more to itself and create more information and convince itself of things that might not be true. And the result is that it might go rogue with these tool calls. And I've seen a lot of instances where a reasoning model like 3.7 reasoning just does dozens of tool calls for basic stuff because it has them and it will check everything constantly. So giving a reasoning model access to tools does not always mean you'll get good answers. As such, a lot of developers, myself included, tend to lean towards non-reasoning models when we're using tools, such as Cursor. So in Cursor, I only use O3 Mini when I'm solving a specific hard problem in a file. When I want to update a variable or change how a function is being used, I still use 3.5 or other similar models. There is one other model that's been winning really hard here recently, though. Gemini 2.5 Pro. I'd go as far as to say 2.5 Pro was the first model to prove that Claude's dominance on code knowledge could actually be beaten out. 2.5 is as good, if not better, at general code stuff, and it's a meaningful improvement in tool calling on Google's side too. It's still not as good as Claude is at choosing when to call what tools and using the data it gets back, but it has improved a ton, and it makes it a viable option in your IDE. I know a ton of people who have moved over to Gemini. I've been planning on doing it myself, but I've been too busy to code a lot, sadly. I very much plan to have my next couple months of dev be on 2.5 Pro and ChatGPT 4.1, unless, of course, new models come out. One more fun call out. They say 4.1 is roughly as good as 4.0 while being 83% cheaper. Very cool to see. Here we are, the code section. 4.1 is a massive jump in code, even performing better than O3 Mini. Again, a lot of that's probably going to be tool calls and not reasoning yourself into gaslighting, but damn, it's performing really, really well on these benchmarks. And it was not before. Now it's in a spitting distance of Claude's best. For API devs looking to edit large files, 4.1 is much more reliable at code diffs across a range of formats. Huge deal. Again, for building this into your editors. All of the AI IDEs have been quick to jump on 4.1, part of why I've been starting to play with it. It's really, really good for this stuff. They specifically trained 4.1 to follow diff formats more reliably, which allows devs to save both cost and latency by only having the model output change lines rather than rewriting an entire file. This is huge if you're trying to build your own AI dev tools, or you're trying to build something like artifacts with GPT 4.1. Now you don't have to regenerate the whole file and apply it in the editor. You can just get the diff and apply it the way you would with any other diff in Git. That's super, super cool to see. That said, they did double the limit for how many tokens can be output in one call, which is a huge change too. Funny enough, the diffing actually made it more accurate overall. When almost every other model they've tested, the diffs perform worse. So it's clear it's actually very good at that. Because of that, you're going to be generating way less tokens and you're going to be spending way less money, which is a huge win. They showcased an example here where they made the same app with both, and it's definitely made a much nicer looking experience here. Like, can handle different fonts totally fine. It has really fancy animations as you fly around in it. Looks pretty good overall. This was the original with 4.0. It still has a fancy-ish animation, but the UI is significantly worse. Click zones are wrong. It doesn't have the sidebar. It's messier. And that's been my experience trying to do code stuff with 4.0. It's just not very good at it. 4.1 seems significantly better. Also seems to have handled the multi-language requests more. It's a good prompt. I like this test. But these are just fun tests. And believe me, there are plenty more of those. My personal favorite will always be the hexagon test. I know it's not great, but it is fun. And 4.1 handled it pretty well. I'm impressed. Surprised that it can make such good physics for that. One interesting detail is that Flavio, the guy who made up this test, is a really big fan of 4.5, which I haven't heard many people say. Particularly sad to see because they mentioned 4.5 in here. 4.5 is now being deprecated because they need more GPUs. At least that's what they said during the announcement. But 4.5 preview will be removed from the API in the near future in order to give access to all these other things and have enough infra for it. We have until July 2025 in order to make that transition. Very fun. 4.5 is so expensive, I don't think many were using it. I'm sure that they're confidently adding this because the numbers show otherwise. So as I was saying, those were all fun, goofy benchmarks. They don't show what real life use is like, though. You know what does? Editors. Seems like they're working closely with Windsurf, probably because Claude is working closely with Cursor. Makes sense they're trying to build friends in the other side. I get it. I know how these corporate politics work. But Windsurf got early access, and they said that 4.1 scores 60% higher than 4.0 does on Windsurf's internal code benchmark, which correlates strongly with how often code changes are actually accepted on the first review. Users noted that it was 30% more efficient in tool calls and 50% less likely to repeat unnecessary edits or read code in overly narrow, incremental steps. Huge win there. That makes this go from unusable to real competition for Claude. Quoto also ran a test across 200 real-world PRs with the same prompts and conditions. 4.1 produced a better suggestion in 55% of cases. I want to see 55% of cases, like, compared to what? Oh, this is comparing to 3.7. Fun. So it's winning over half, but it's like neck and neck now with 3.7. I am curious how 3.5 would have performed here, though. But this benchmark being included and them not saying Claude here is what it's performing in 55% of cases shows that they are very clearly trying to respond to Anthropic here without saying the word Anthropic here. It's a very interesting position they're in. So that's the code performance. I want to cover the tooling stuff because, again,
An open world massively multiplayer online role-playing game with complete freedom to do almost anything you can imagine at any time, and in first or third person view. Live as an honest civilian, a criminal, a police officer, paramedic, firefighter, or one of several other in-depth careers. No levels, no skill grinding, just the actions you perform and knowledge of the role. Player-driven gameplay with player-driven economy, an enormous persistent world where every aspect is controlled by the players, for the players, gain money, rent property, grow businesses, coming soon to PC. This was the pitch for a Kickstarter game called Identity, all the way back on January 5th, 2015. The project managed to surpass their goal and go on to raise over 10 times the amount of money they claimed to need, all the while delivering almost nothing to the fans. Was this another scam Kickstarter, or did things just not go to plan? This is Kickstarter to Court. Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform where anyone can show up, explain their project, their product, their idea, regardless of the viability, stage of development, or experience, and see if people will give them money to pursue it. The platform has been the subject of much scrutiny over the years, due to not only the prevalence of scams, but also delusional dreamers trying to make it big. No group has experienced these issues quite like the gamers. This is more so true for the MMORPG genre, which is notorious for being the most expensive and time-consuming to develop. Despite this being common knowledge, the early years of Kickstarter saw many of them raising millions of dollars, and almost none of them materialized at all. Games like Chronicles of Valyria found their start on Kickstarter, raising over $1 million before leaving the 30-day funding window, then continuing to take pledges independently to the tune of $8 million. Despite the massive amount of additional funding, there was never a product shipped, even 6 years later. The same goes for things like Camelot Unchained, with their $4.4 million and no game release after 9 years. And of course, the crowning jewel of Kickstarter, Star Citizen, initially raising $2 million in late 2012 and going on to raise $450 million in the 10 years since, without a finished product on the immediate horizon, and this list goes on and on. But back in 2015 when Identity showed up, people were not aware of how these games were going to go. They didn't have this hindsight. They still had hope. And there are pros to backing games on Kickstarter. You are not relying on the big money to give you something new, innovative and fun. Instead, putting the money in the hands of passionate people just like you that might have fresh ideas. It's an alluring concept that saw people more willing to throw money down for what has been described as dream games. Identity is one such game. As an elevator pitch, it sounds like what you might have thought games would be a decade into the future, but we never quite got there. It sounds like a game that many people, me included, have always wanted. Think of Grand Theft Auto Online mode, but with full persistence in a massive open world with everyone playing their roles and living a second life online. No loading screens, no pay to win, just freedom to do what you want in a world full of other players doing what they want. People were so excited by this prospect that 5 of them said, I will give you $5,000 each, and you will give me a promise that I will visit the office and spend half the day gaming with a team. Though there was no office, and the team consisted of only 2 people, information that was conveniently absent from the Kickstarter funding page. So let's go back to the start. We have an unknown game studio with unknown developers claiming to make a game that would change everything, a familiar concept when looking at Kickstarter in retrospect. The studio behind Identity was created in October of 2014 by a man named John Vandersvet. 3 months later, he launched the Kickstarter asking for 150,000 Canadian dollars. When describing the risks and challenges of backing Identity, as is mandated by Kickstarter, John claimed to have invested lots of his own money and just needed help to get over the finish line. The implication being, the race had begun, they were already running, and the finish line was conceivable at this time. Should we meet our goal here on Kickstarter, we'll have everything we need to ensure that Identity gets completed. A very bold statement that exists to reassure backers. Your money is safe. If you trust me, I will deliver your dream game. If we get 150,000, you will get Identity. And he succeeded. 180,000 Canadian dollars was raised in the 30-day window. It was on. Identity was coming. Retrospectively, looking at the Kickstarter page from back then, what many people either missed or didn't pay any attention to was the message that immediately followed John's assurance of delivery. We need you. Identity is going to cost a lot more than 150,000 to produce. Our Kickstarter is a proof of concept to several investors, and with its success, we'll have the funding we need. Which means you were not buying into a sure thing, you were buying into a proof of concept to lure in the big money, and without that big money, Identity could not be delivered, in John's own words. Throughout the Kickstarter campaign's history, when it first arrived and then in the months following, John made several references to being in contact with, quote, big publishers or groups of investors that would back his vision. For example, in a post on January 6, 2015, the second day of their fundraise, when John states that they had been approached by some of the largest publishers in the industry, securing their future should it be necessary. This quote would of course lead the public to further assume that Identity, and by extension John, was a safe bet. It's only now that we can look back and put the pieces together to see what went wrong. Despite claiming the project was contingent on investors coming in to support the financial side of Asylum Entertainment, John would claim to, quote, set aside offers he was receiving so they could maintain complete control of the game's creative direction, or you could say the game's identity. The idea here, of course, being that while ever the public was still giving him money, he didn't really have to take money from somebody else and give them some of that equity, some of that ownership, and some of that say into the product he was making. So that is exactly what they did. They opened up a website where they continued to take in pledges and sold passports to the public that would allow them entry into this fantasy world when it was ready, in less than 2 years' time according to the Kickstarter page, and so as the months ticked by, their budget increased. After the initial raise, things went relatively quiet in terms of major updates. After all, Rome was not built in a day. The only gameplay that had ever been seen by the public was that of the initial Kickstarter trailer, and it only contained a handful of stills from asset packs found online for a few $dozen each on the Unreal Engine marketplace, as well as some concept art and a voiceover that explained each aspect of the game and what you would be doing once it was completed. The forums, as well as the other social media hubs during the initial year, could be described as a mixed bag. Most people were of course hopeful for the game, as this was really a dream come true. Some people were starting to get a little agitated by the lack of progress on display, and a small number of people were simply firm in their belief that something was off. The very first post on the Identity official forums using the keyword scam came from user QWER28 on March 19th, 2016. I don't have concerns. I know this is a scam. They make one slideshow video and start this project. Now everything that they are doing are some sketches, many talks. They have programmed absolutely nothing. It's my belief as a content creator that sometimes being early is the same as being wrong. QWER28 was ahead of the curve on his accusations, and so his post was met with mockery. This is despite the fact other users were voicing less accusatory but similar sentiments throughout the thread. The major complaints at this time, just over a year post Kickstarter success and an additional $40,000 raised, was that there was zero progress shown. Few, if any, screenshots of anything in-game had been posted, and absolutely no gameplay footage released. There was no evidence that there was a game even being developed. This is especially concerning when looking at it within context. The Identity team had claimed closed beta would be available in December of 2016, and it was already March. Closed beta would be, quote, mostly complete with bug fixing and polishing remaining, meaning they had less than 9 months to put together an entire feature complete game, and if things were going to plan, screenshots and gameplay at this stage should have been very simple to show, especially when your studio relies entirely on public perception to continue operation with the public's funding. The reasons given from John on the Identity forums as to why there wasn't any progress being shown was that they were so busy. They wore so many different hats, referring to the different roles each of them had to take on as it was a small business. They simply didn't have time to manage the public relations. Posting updates would take away precious time from development, and it wasn't a priority. This is why over the coming months, communication remained mostly surface level. Small teasers were released, whether by word or concept art. They made hints at upcoming milestones such as gameplay footage and trailers, as well as what they called the Town Square module. This would be the first playable experience of Identity. They intended to release the game in pieces, to test each as they became available, gather feedback, and fix things as they go. The town square would allow players to create a character, explore the small area, access their Kickstarter rewards like apartments which they could then decorate, and meet friends to, quote, enjoy a handful of interesting and fun things to do. In October of 2016, John penned an update to talk about their funding situation and the impending town square release, which would be coming in early 2017, which was late, but would bring with it an expansion of their funding in a very, very big way, which would speed up development drastically and bring about a full game release shortly after. In November of 2016, the unthinkable happened. They released a video titled Identity Insider Housing, the first ever look at gameplay since the Kickstarter almost 2 years prior.
This here is an apartment in Ash Hill. It's still not quite complete. We have a little more work left to do on interface and such, but even as it is, it's the most complete player housing I've ever seen in MMO. And this is a bookshelf is sort of a special container, so it can hold items like other things, but really it only holds books. And what's cool is when you put books in there, they're actually visible right on there.
This was it, the proof of concept, the validation of so many people's expectations. The reception was incredibly positive with a like to dislike ratio of 4,000 to 61. The top comment reads simply, finally, great to hear from you guys, which does illustrate that the communication of Asylum Entertainment had to this point been terrible, but people were happy that things were finally starting to turn around. Oh my god, this game looks like the best ever created. This game looks almost too good to be true. I really can't wait. But of course, this was not a change in the tide, and waiting is exactly what they would be doing, waiting for another year for even a glimpse of anything new. Often we ask the question, why would somebody do something in a certain way, ignoring the obvious answer as it's too convenient? With identity at this time, you might have asked, why do they not communicate with the community more often when their funding relies entirely on said community? And the obvious answer was that despite the lack of progress shown, people were still handing over their money and the developers saw no urgency to their current situation. However, something was changing by August 29th of 2017, almost a full year since the housing video released. They started to take communication a little more seriously. This came in the form of the Identity Development Clothing Pipeline, a 2-hour 22-minute long video with background music and brief narration while 3D art assets for the game were created. At this point you can see what difference 1 year can make to perception within a community when people have paid money and have been left hanging. Many comments made fun of the boring nothing burger video. I look forward to the next exciting episode in 2019, watch me paint a wall, then see it dry. Even the positive comments reveal the sentiment of the community to be that of impatience. I know someone reads all of these comments. Please take your time on this game. Do not listen to the ones who demand a playable client. I've been waiting years for a well-developed role-playing game. I will wait many more. And honestly, it seemed like the wait was starting to pay off, as the clothing pipeline video was not the only one to be released at that time. The team spent the next few days doing 1 to 2 hour long live streams with different members of Asylum showing what they were working on. And although it was entirely art assets, not actual gameplay, it was still more than the community had seen in years and showed that they were employing people to work on something and that they not just ran away with the money and were stringing people along. However, this something turned out to be one of the first real nails in the coffin of identity. On September 21st, 2017, a Twitch livestream took place with the producer of Identity and one of the environmental artists. The YouTube video that was subsequently uploaded is titled Identity Development 3D Prop Modeling. In this stream, Lee, the environmental artist, showed the creation of some assets in the application Maya 2016. If you zoom in to the top left of the application window, it says Maya 2016 trial version. Little did anyone in the public know, this landed Asylum Entertainment in hot water. You're not allowed to use a trial version of that software in this commercial fashion, and they had done so on a live stream. This, according to John Vandersvet, when I interviewed him researching this video, led to about $60,000 of legal fees and forced licenses taken from their budget. John claimed this artist was a freelancer and it was the artist's responsibility to have the licenses, a case that they would have won in court, but decided instead to settle the case with an out-of-court agreement due to not having the fees to fight it. Had this been public information at the time, it's likely that funding would have dried up right there and then. With a lack of transparency for the product being created, the lack of meaningful progress being shown, and the incompetence of management actions like this, the writing was on the wall for Identity to be a failure to launch. To the backers though, everything was business as usual, and they were seeing more progress than they'd ever done before, so why not continue? The next major news came on November 3rd, 2017 with a promise of progress. On March 21st, the Town Square module will be live. Not exactly what people were promised with a fully functioning closed beta in December of 2016, but at least this was something, right? The moment everyone had been waiting for was almost here. The first time they would get into their dream game that they'd been expecting to play 2 years prior. At this time, Asylum had raised over $830,000 from almost 20,000 customers and claimed in this update to have rented an office space to house the growing studio. They talked of seeking new recruits, expanding the team, and all the good things to come. It seemed everything was going great, but anyone with a business eye should have been starting to question how any of these finances made sense. $830,000 sounds like a lot, but it had been over 2.5 years since the initial $200,000 arrived. Even if everyone at the company were taking lower than industry standard salaries, there's no way it would have been prudent to suddenly hire office space at $2,000 a month just in rent, as well as further bloating the salary budget. They were clearly banking on major funding coming in soon, likely with the release of the Town Square module, which they would sell on Steam for around $30 US. On top of this, they were also about to do the unthinkable. February 12th, 2018, Identity Crime and Punishment gameplay. And people couldn't believe it. Holy shit, actual gameplay. Glad to see the game progressing. I really hope this game will come out, LMAO. Finally, looks like the hard work and the delayed release paid off as well. But not everybody was happy, and this timeline didn't bring in the big bucks as they were expecting. The trailer showed very little gameplay, especially for 3 years of development. What they did show was incredibly rudimentary for the year of 2018. Animations were awfully implemented, area of gameplay shown was very small, and the voice acting was laughable.
What are you doing there? Get that bloody leap fixed.
Get out now. I will shoot.
While this isn't a smoking gun, and perhaps people were expecting too much polish from such a small team, it did raise more concerns than it answered. What had they been doing all this time, and where did the money go? The community was in a constant tug of war, with there being 3 factions. One defended the game, the studio and John vehemently, the other was convinced they'd all been taken in by an elaborate scam, and the third was somewhere in between. After years of investigating Kickstarter scams and things like that, there's one thing that always holds true. Time will reveal all. The developers were adamant that things were going great, that the game was coming very soon, and it would be everything they claimed. The number of believers had dwindled by this point, but with the first module releasing in just a month's time, they didn't need to believe. They just needed to wait, and all would be revealed. Though they'd be waiting longer than what they thought. The one unfortunate bit of news this developer blog brought was the mention of a date change for Module 1. Originally slated for March 21st, the Town Square module is now scheduled for April 23rd release. Despite the social media sentiment, despite concerns for the trailer, despite the delays that repeatedly happened, the finances continued to increase at a rate faster than ever before. They'd raised over $1 million by this stage, proving that the most powerful element of crowdfunding a game is not delivery, but the emotions that an idea evoke in the potential customers. Identity was late, but it was still a dream game for many people, and if they had to wait, they would wait. If their money could help it come true, money well spent. For all the people that were angry over the delays, the reality is that 1 month isn't a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, and they'd already been waiting for 3 years. So what is 30 more days? Except when April 20th, 2018 arrived, just 3 days prior to the alleged new release date, it brought with it yet another delay, and this time there were no messages of encouragement. Instead, more accusations that this was a scam. The reason given for the delays were always extremely vague, claiming to just be last-minute issues, and this time there was no new date given. Instead, Paratus, the project lead, claimed very soon, but still, funding continued to grow. I'll not bore you with the next few delays, because what was very soon turned into months. Identity claimed to be releasing in December of 2016 as a full game. What they got was Module 1, a small social hub, on November 30th of 2018, almost 4 years since the Kickstarter began. I believe it's true that reality never really lives up to the expectation of dreams. It's unreasonable to expect, but Identity was no longer a dream, it was a nightmare.
Why is it supposed to be this dark? I can't see anything. I knew this was gonna happen. Okay, this is new. I can hear random people beside me when I'm nowhere near anyone. I guess that's people trying to go to their apartment or something.
It's observable in gaming that if a product has a rocky history or the developers make enemies of their community, they're only one good release away from redemption. Make a good product and people will quickly forget what you did wrong. Asylum Entertainment had struggled with public perception for years now, but had one redeeming quality. The power of imagination. Imagination got the game funded, imagination carried the game to this point, and continued to bring them in money. The second this Town Square module released, people could no longer imagine the product they paid for, and it was clear that these developers were never capable of delivering it in the first place. This led to crowdfunding completely drying up. Nobody was giving money on the website anymore for pledges, as they lost faith in the game completely. The Steam reviews sat at mostly negative, and that was also not bringing in any money. Remembering back to October 21st of 2016 when John said, quote, "We've been approached by publishers promising a good chunk of development money. We set them aside so that we can maintain total control over Identity. We want to make sure that you get the game you're dreaming of with no compromises put in place by publishers in order to push something out of the door." Had there been interested parties back then, nobody can really say. Between the release of Identity on November 30th, 2018 and the current date, August 2022, there's been almost nothing added to the game in any meaningful way. The only playable experience remains the Town Square module that allows you to create a character with bare bones options and walk around a tiny area, counting how many things still do not work despite being reported as bugs 4 years earlier. The $1.6 million raised is completely gone, and what remains is 10% of the game they promised. Of that 10%, almost none of it works. That is after 7 years of development and raising over 10 times the amount of money they asked for initially. The claim they made was 150,000 Canadian dollars would guarantee this game, but $1.6 million later, and this is what people got.
I'm jumping, I'm crouching, I can't even stand up now. Like, I'm in the wall.
Oh, God. Hello, inside of face.
We can see things, like, over here, like, look, there's concrete. Why is there concrete inside the hotel? Like, please do tell me. Like, fix that.
Oh, yeah. I've shoplifted. And the game crashed.
So now you know the timeline of development. Let's dive into some of the information regarding Asylum Entertainment, Identity, and the creators. Game development is hard, and they fail all of the time. It's possible to have great intentions, be very honest, and just miss the mark. Money runs out, things don't go to plan, and you just have to move on with life. This happens to big companies all the time. People are adamant that John, the CEO, set out to scam people and walked away with all that money. I'm going to present to you my findings after investigating what I could about all those involved, as well as what John himself had to say when I interviewed him. First, let's address the CEO, the oddities surrounding how he presented himself. John Vandersvet claimed to not only be a veteran programmer and game designer, but also an MMORPG veteran developer, giving him credibility in the field. This is, in my opinion, disingenuously presented at the best, or at worst a lie. John worked for 1 year doing web development for Curse Incorporated, before moving to a small indie development company based in Sweden called Starvault AB that created Mortal Online, the MMORPG. While working for Starvault for 4 years and 10 months, John only ever worked on things using Flash, such as a book UI and die system that was then implemented by the other developers. He never at any point had access to the backend code or anything related to the infrastructure of making an MMORPG that would give him any claim to be a veteran in creating games for the genre. The biggest component of making an online game, specifically on the scale of an MMO, is the networking solution. He didn't ever work on this for Starvault, so he did not have that experience. His only other position listed on LinkedIn was working for 2 years, 7 months as CEO of a business called Vandernet Incorporated, which I couldn't find any incorporation records for, nor any active products. Immediately after his exit from Starvault, he started Asylum Entertainment in October of 2014, and within 3 months made the Kickstarter for Identity, which means he had no veteran game development or major development experience in his work history, besides making a mod for military sim game Armor, which was called Altis Life, which is a far cry from creating a game from the ground up. That is, unless he elected to hide said experience from his LinkedIn profile, his prior employers, as well as from the public, which makes very little sense, as it would build up his credibility, which is clearly what he was trying to do. The Kickstarter, which was the launching point for this entire story, stated almost immediately that despite Identity being a very ambitious project, people could believe in John because the two projects he'd worked on, Mortal and Altis, had solved many of the issues that would arise during development. This is semantically not a lie, because Mortal Online as an MMORPG built in Unreal Engine has solved these problems. It's just that John was not the person to work on or solve any of those problems. On top of this, once the Kickstarter was successfully funded, John's first hire for a full-time developer was a man named Henrik Sonesson, who he met while working at Starvault. Henriksen was let go from Starvault as, according to a source within the company, quote, "He was a junior and we were looking for seniors to move forward with the MMO." Remembering back to the start, it was said that $150,000 was just a proof of concept to show investors. John claimed multiple times that they were in touch with some of the biggest publishers in the world, that they were promised good chunks of money for continued development, and he, quote, "set them aside so they can maintain total control over Identity." The entire Kickstarter premise, the entire promise John made to people for the money raised, was not only that they would take on investment to guarantee the game was finished, but in fact they needed to do so, which means when he refused to take publisher money, it either never existed and was another lie to project confidence in the project's success, or he sabotaged the entire development, wasting everyone's money producing nothing, while paying himself a salary for 4 years. It's proven that from day one, John knew they needed private investment to get the game made, consistently claimed to have interested parties, and then set them aside for creative freedom. He made the decision to have no game instead of one that made compromises. When I spoke to John privately, he stated he never turned down any offers, which essentially means that he lied to the public when he said he was setting them aside because they didn't have offers to set aside in the first place. So either he's lying to me now because of the failures, or he was lying to the public back then, which of course was still at the time giving him money. On June 25th, 2020, well after they'd ran out of money and after things had soured really badly, a newsletter was sent out to accounts following Identity, in which John talked about the road ahead. The game details are not the relevant part of the newsletter, as you've seen from this video. The progress from 2018 to 2022 was so small that any promises made were entirely without merit. The pertinent information comes during a section titled Budget and Fundraising. In this section, John described the Identity financial situation, stating their annual developer salary budget was about $170,000. What they needed to do was raise more money passively. This is where he introduced Furballs, a mobile game inspired by Rocket League. He claimed that Asylum Entertainment had been tasked with acting as a publisher for the title, and quote, "While the Asylum team is not contributing to the development of Furballs, we are helping to get their game out to an audience." He also outlines that Furballs is on Kickstarter, and if it's funded, will help fund Identity. If we are able to do so, Identity will have secured additional funding going forward. You'll be supporting two great games at the same time. In essence, he's emailing the people who paid for a game called Identity 5 years ago, which they never received, asking them to fund another Kickstarter game, a game that he wasn't even working on. And the idea behind this being, if they don't do it, the likelihood they get Identity is lower, which in and of itself can be described as unsavory, but that isn't the worst part. Doing an open corporate search for John Vandersvet reveals he's the creator and director of both Asylum Entertainment, the developers of Identity, and Phony Games, the developers of Furballs, which means this newsletter is at best a lie by omission. He speaks about Asylum Games being us and Phony Games being them, but both are him. This again is odd, since he leaves the fact he owns the second development studio off of his LinkedIn profile, but when this information went public, John took to the forums to explain himself. He worked on Furballs as a small project in his off time. He claims that no one from Asylum or the Identity team ever worked on Furballs, and that he funded the project entirely out of his own pocket. This is a contradiction to the newsletter where he stated no one from Asylum worked on the project, as he, the owner of Asylum, was now admitting to have done so, even if just in his spare time, if we are to believe that. There has also been no accounting for the money used, allegedly, for Identity development, or how he would have the money on hand to hire dozens of people separately from Identity that apparently worked on Furballs. This also ties into earlier claims he made when stating they were simply too busy to post updates about the game or keep their paying customers informed on the situation, but he did have time to create a second company and develop an entirely new game. The narrative here from people within the community is that John allocated resources away from Identity, resources the public gave him for Identity, instead creating this mobile game with the intention to use a second Kickstarter raise, repeating the cycle of what he'd already done for the last 5 years. Furballs failed the Kickstarter campaign, and the Discord server for the project reveals information about John that backs up the fact he lied about his experience in video game development. As a recall to earlier, when creating online games, the biggest roadblock is the networking. According to John on the 21st of September 2020, quote, "There's really just one piece left to develop though. The gameplay itself is there, only the matchmaking/servers bit left." This was also mentioned 8 months earlier in January. Furballs was due to launch into a beta in October of 2020, and as of August 2022, the game is still unreleased. Still, just a couple of weeks of networking development left until the game can launch. John also constantly claims that they have, quote, "other projects on the go in an effort to raise money, and that they are looking good, so it shouldn't be long," something John has been claiming since March of 2021. They're always just a few months away from securing the funding and finishing each one of these games. The question is, why would John not finish Furballs with all of his networking experience in his spare time if he believed it would be the savior of Identity, when in his own words, it was just a couple of weeks from being completed? When I spoke to John about all this, he claimed that big things were still coming, and that the reason he does not tell his community about them is because he doesn't want to get them excited just to let them down again. Instead, he's not posted publicly on Discord for over a year and leaves the people who paid for his dream completely in the dark. While it cannot be proven from the outside that John misappropriated his customers' money to create a mobile cash grab game, it is what many believe, and this may not be the only time funds may have been misplaced. The Asylum Entertainment business was registered at a residential property in Ontario, Canada during October of 2014. This property was thoroughly in the middle of nowhere. John owned this house from 2011. However, this is not the only property John used to register his businesses, which allowed me to put together a timeline. John moved to another address about 1 hour away from his home in August of 2015. He purchased this house with a mortgage, which was then paid off in full 1 month later according to land ownership records that I acquired. This purchase happened just 6 months after the Kickstarter cash infusion that John received. Buying a house in and of itself wouldn't raise any red flags usually, but doing so and then paying off a mortgage 1 month later is extremely odd, especially when John's previous house was then sold 2 months later for roughly the same amount of money that the Kickstarter raised. Now, it's entirely possible this is purely coincidence and he did not misappropriate any funds, but seeing the timeline, you could make a theory here that John bought the house and paid off the mortgage with the Kickstarter money, then sold his old house to replenish said money. John then sold this house in 2020 and moved to a more expensive house where he currently holds a mortgage. In my conversations with John, he claims to have paid himself almost no salary during the time working at Asylum, and that he is in fact over $80,000 in debt on the venture. While I can't say if this is true, it does seem odd that he was able to consistently move up the property ladder into increasingly expensive homes while making a loss on the business, while not paying himself much of a salary, and while also paying to make multiple other projects that didn't take money from any of the identity funds. In my experience of Kickstarter, the more ambitious the idea, the more it tends to ignite the imagination. It's very possible that John is the dastardly scammer that people believe him to be. In my experience, life is very rarely black or white and exists entirely in the grey. It's most likely that John had a dream, he saw the opportunity to give the dream a shot using the low personal risk of crowdfunding, and entirely overestimated his abilities as a developer and, more importantly, as a business owner. In pursuit of that dream, he omitted key information, he embellished his experience, and made some poor decisions. These are characterizations that John disagreed with when we spoke, not seeing the problem in anything outlined in this video. He claims they never had any offers from publishers, despite having many talks, and that he stopped pursuing funding after a while because crowdfunding was just simply going so well. He doesn't believe that what he said about his experience in MMORPG development would give anyone false confidence, and he is still working towards delivering Identity, even if it's the last thing he ever does. Regardless of what I believe, I leave it up to you, the audience, to draw your conclusion. At the end of the day, whether he was malevolent, whether he lied, or whether everything was above board, the result is the same. 7 years, $1.6 million, and no game. John was the beneficiary of the MMORPG Kickstarter craze of the early to mid 2010s, and Identity turned out much like the rest, existing only in the imaginations of those who dared to dream of their perfect game. A true sandbox survival horror. Fight to survive against a zombie-packed post-apocalyptic world that gives you, the player, freedom to choose how to do so. Settle down inside a house, fortifying the entrances with advanced expansive crafting and fortification systems, grow crops in a fully fleshed out farming system, and even build electrical devices to keep the lights on and the power tools working. Outside the potential safety of your house is a dangerous place where zombies might be the least of your worries. The massive, beautiful terrain of Alberta, Canada comes with a full weather system, day-night cycle, and of course other survivors that want what you have. Explore, fight, build, survive. This was the pitch for Dead Matter on their Kickstarter campaign back on July 17th, 2017. A dream game in a genre that has seen some of the most demand from gamers around the world since the breakout of DayZ mod back in May of 2012. DayZ managed to reach over 1 million players in just 3 months, eventually going on to become a standalone game that sold millions of copies around the globe. Dead Matter was described by many to be the ultimate delivery of what DayZ should have been, and yet, as of August 2022, has not delivered on that dream. So let's go back to where it all started, 10 years ago.
So Johnny, tell us what your mod is about.
Dead Matter is a open world zombie survival mod for Crysis 2. I had originally started working on it in November 2011, and now I'm kind of sitting right here.
In March 2012, the user Johnny Guitar created a project on popular video game modding website moddb.com titled Dead Matter. He can be seen as early as March 7th, 2012, replying to comments from those who found the entry and had excitement for the prospect of playing this game. This project was originally proposed as a mod for first-person shooter Crysis 2, but Johnny Guitar made it very clear he and his small team were looking to create a standalone version of the game to turn the fan project into a real business. The goal was a Kickstarter, but they needed more people on the team, and Johnny's idea for achieving this was to ask random users to private message him if they were interested in giving him money. At this point, a handful of screenshots and a music file were all that were on display, but there was a promise of a teaser trailer coming soon, with a playable download coming shortly after. On July 16th, the teaser released, and if you look back, it's pretty comically bad. Despite this, the comments were mostly full of excitement. The next update came 4 months later with developer vlog number 1, part 1 of 2, which released on November 27th, 2012, in which Johnny Guitar shows some technical aspects of the mod like bullet drop, zombies, as well as houses and barricading, and in the second part of the vlog, 11 minutes of in-game footage, running around, shooting zombies, looting things, driving vehicles, and commentary from its creator. Just over a week later, on December 9th, 2012, Reddit user Nikizor, which also happens to be Johnny Guitar, posted that the Dead Matter closed alpha was here. Users could finally get their hands on this Crysis 2 mod. Following this, they continued to develop the mod as well as working on an apparent standalone game, but it wasn't long until the drama started to kick in. An update that should have been available shortly after the closed alpha release was delayed until April of 2013, months later, due to a rogue staff member taking over the Dead Matter website and Facebook page. Following this, the mod was talked about less and less, and the focus was clearly on delivering a standalone experience which the developers would be able to monetize effectively. And then nothing. They just stopped posting, they stopped talking about the mod, they stopped talking about the standalone, and everything just went dark. That is until on March 30th, 2016, a post appeared titled "After All This Time" on the since deleted website deadmatter.rocks. Unfortunately, due to the fact nobody archived these websites, all of the contents are completely missing. What remains are Reddit images and threads, usually with 1 or 2 comments, and often involving people discussing how they forgot they were even subscribed to the game's Reddit in the first place, and interest seemed to be at an all-time low. That is until December 13th, 2016, where Dead Matter made it onto Steam under the umbrella of the since-retired Greenlight program. Greenlight allowed for developers to get their game listed on Steam via popular vote. Within the first few days, Dead Matter had hundreds of comments and went on to become the 4th highest ranking game in the program's history. Needless to say, the interest for what they were trying to create was abundant. Just under 8 months later, on July 17, 2017, Dead Matter launched their Kickstarter campaign. The goal, as you'll often find on Kickstarter projects, was a laughably small amount, 60,000 Canadian dollars, which is around 50,000 US. Absolutely nothing in terms of making a game, but Dead Matter had been in development for 5 years already. Allegedly. The developers, now known as Quantum Integrity, were no longer just a man making a mod, it was an actual studio that had been incorporated. Within the Kickstarter, they do discuss this number and stipulate that within these $50,000, they've budgeted to be able to pull off a successful early access game launch, which is where they will then gather the rest of funds required to finish the whole project. Of course, anything more is welcome and will mean additional features for the early access launch, but how it's worded is that if the Kickstarter succeeds, the game will make it to early access no matter what. Alongside this, they speak a handful of times about their transparent development process, the importance of showing everything to their fans, as well as their vow to never delete comments or silence the voices of their followers, an important promise that, while naive, does come into play a little bit later. Over the next 30 days until August 17th of 2017, the campaign went on to raise $285,784 Canadian, which is around 220,000 US. To raise this amount, the QI team presented what is referred to as stretch goals, in which they promise additional content or features for each milestone of funding reached. These stretch goals had planes and trains, including all infrastructure required to use them, a brand new map modelled after Vancouver Island, along with new enemies, weapons, clothes, vehicles, and places to explore, New interactive AI settlements and factions, radio and radio stations, modular gear, new weapons, enhanced Twitch support, and player-made structures. All of these goals are massive undertakings, especially for a small indie team who'd already committed to building a sincerely ambitious game using what is a team lead's annual salary to be divvied up amongst their entire company, minus taxes of course. Anyone familiar with this video series, video game development, or running a business will know that this would be impossible. However, it didn't stop people from believing in the dream, which I always say is much more important than the reality, especially when it comes to things people really want. 5,452 backers threw down their money in support, some of which were so convinced that they parted with thousands of dollars for packages that promised them things like 50 copies of the game, a producer credit, and an invitation to their launch party in Calgary, Alberta. Following the Kickstarter's massive success, QI immediately began selling packages on their own website store, giving latecomers the opportunity to buy in and support development of the definitive zombie survival experience, as well as launching an Indiegogo campaign on the 6th of February 2018 with a goal of $46,000, which went on to raise roughly $1.5 million in the next 30 days. At this point in the story, they've raised all the money they said that they needed, and I could run you through each development blog, which showed an impressively made game and many features people have been yearning for in this genre ever since the initial craze of DayZ mod. However, the most important and interesting parts of the story come from behind the scenes, as well as how the company acted towards fans that supported their shared vision. Dead Matter as a project has been plagued with delays since the very inception, all the way back in 2012 with the Crysis 2 mod. There have always been problems. Back then, it was a couple of friends with a shared love of what they were trying to create, and there was no money involved, which makes it much more acceptable to just get things done when you can and not be held to deadlines. When you become a business, ask for $80,000 and raise close to $2 million plus whatever they raised privately on their website, this becomes an issue. You're now a business making promises. You now have to worry about the perception of your game, the perception of the management, and what's going on with your community, as you are beholden to them. Each problem, each delay, each change brings with it disappointment, especially when no one has been able to even play what they expected to get in their hands years previously. The QI team seemed to talk a great game at this time. They showed juicy content in their frequent blogs, but seemed incapable of launching the product in a timely manner, even in an early access or closed alpha state. This led to people being rightly unhappy, and when they shared this opinion, you can guess exactly what happened. Censoring dissenting opinions, something the Kickstarter campaign vowed not to do, turning the Discord into a fairly unpleasant place, which was heavily moderated, with even slight criticism or questioning of information being met with incredibly unprofessional behavior and often bans.
Running a community like a dictatorship and then responding to criticism by hiding behind a bot to send sarcastic and petty remarks while simultaneously denouncing those same practices from your community members and then demanding their respect is a very bad look. Not only is it distasteful, but it's extremely unprofessional. It has been a continued problem in the Dead Matter community that you aren't allowed to question things or even engage in civil discourse if it does not fit the agenda of these mods and community reps and even partners.
The delays were not the only thing that were an issue. There was a lot of mixed messaging regarding the expectations of the constantly impending closed alpha. How would it happen? What would be the details? Many people familiar with alphas were bringing up the topic of an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, a contract signed by users to prevent them from discussing or showing materials covered under said contract under penalty of punishment, which would include a game ban, as well as potential civil lawsuits should the offender do any significant damage to the studio or their product. Multiple sources, including the CEO of the company, had answered this question frequently. The game would not be under NDA, they would continue to be transparent as they promised in their initial Kickstarter and Indiegogo. This changed as of roughly May 26, 2019, when the question came up again, and this time confirmed that an NDA would in fact exist for all closed alpha testers.
And a couple of months ago, we have been told that no, there wouldn't be any type of NDA, but now it seems like they have switched their mind. Now they are going to be implementing this in the closed alpha. I haven't seen any reasoning why they have done this, but what I can see is that it is going to be used to prevent any type of negativity to go out in the public. We do know that this is indeed a closed alpha, meaning it's going to be first launched to the backers, and we are going to be experiencing a lot of bugs and glitches.
Of course, course, at this stage, most of the promises made in the initial Kickstarter campaign were completely broken, banning users who had criticism for the team when they said they never would, locking the game state behind a legally binding contract, not delivering the product even in a diminished state by any of the estimated dates, and backers would soon be finding out that many of the promised features were nowhere near ready, flat out didn't work, or were scrapped altogether. A lot of the things that they were showing in the blogs simply wasn't in the game. So after years of delays, the alpha release was finally going to happen. On July 27th, 2020, a Reddit post detailed how to claim your alpha key from the QI software website, and anyone who backed at an appropriate level in the 3 years of prior crowdfunding would be able to do so. This, as with almost everything regarding Dead Matter, did not go as planned. There were thousands of users who had backed the game who could simply not see their purchase when registering on the website, therefore they couldn't redeem a key. That was if you were lucky enough to get the website to load, which the Dead Matter Twitter account acknowledged with their advice, stop pressing F5, referring to people refreshing the site over and over again in their attempt to gain access, but instead overloading the service with traffic. These problems, while frustrating, are expected when a game with tens of thousands of hyped fans are about to finally get their hands on something they've been dreaming about for, in some cases, 8 years. With a little bit of communication from the devs and over a couple of days, these issues would resolve themselves. Instead of communicating, however, the developers claimed they were getting too much toxicity and locked down the Discord server. They also claimed the website was being DDoSed, which stands for Distributed Denial of Service, a malicious attack that aims to take a service offline by sending constant bombardments of traffic to that source. And while this could be true, realistically, this distraction was not the biggest issue. These problems were actually a blessing in disguise, just nobody in the public knew it as of yet. When the Discord server was opened again, there were constant updates from the team stating they would keep working to get keys sent out to backers. Behind the scenes, however, there was a key shortage, and I'm not talking about a few hundred of them missing, I mean tens of thousands. This was a massive issue that they knew about but didn't delay the launch, because that would have been seen as yet another delay. It was easier to just blame it on other factors. According to posts in the announcement section of the Dead Matter official Discord, this key problem persisted for about 5 days. Essentially what happened is that when Dead Matter was launching their closed alpha on the Steam platform, to do so they would need to request keys from Valve, the company who owns and operates Steam. Valve, for whatever reason, were holding these keys back from QI, which means there were none to give to the public who would back the game and required those keys to download and play. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why exactly this happened, so to clear this up, I had conversations with multiple current or former employees of QI, which asked, of course, to remain nameless. Each person interviewed told the same story regarding the lack of preparedness for this launch. Despite it being known about internally for a real long time and coming at the end of a 7-day public countdown, the keys they were due to give to backers were simply not requested until a couple days before the scheduled release, which means when Valve said no, there wasn't any leeway for them to solve the matter without doing a delay. According to these sources, they went ahead with the launch knowing full well they didn't have any keys to give people. The CEO, Nick Zorko, or Johnny Guitar as he's known from the start of the story, eventually convinced Valve to give them the keys, but it was in small batches. The reason Valve initially declined is the sheer volume of keys requested in such a short period of time. This illustrates a lack of foresight, planning, and competence directly from management, leaving the most integral part of the launch until the very last minute without any contingency plan really has no excuse at all. They were incredibly lucky that Valve worked with them to resolve it in a handful of days, or this could have been an even bigger blunder that was entirely avoidable given they had months to prepare the keys for distribution. To reiterate, they only requested the keys 24 to 48 hours prior to launch, were told no, and then decided to go through with the launch anyway. This situation brought about a massive issue for QI, the Dead Matter community, and the potential growth of the business. As part of the arrangement between Nick Zorko, the CEO, and Valve to get these tens of thousands of keys delivered for the closed alpha, Valve also stipulated that keys for the closed alpha could no longer be sold for Dead Matter on any platform until it was ready to be sold on Steam. The reason for this should be quite clear. Steam takes 30% cut on all sales, and QI was selling tens of thousands of keys on their website, well expecting Valve to generate those keys, have the game deployed on Steam, and get nothing at all in return. These messages updating the community, as with many messages in the official Dead Matter announcement server, comes from a user with a white name. Anyone familiar with Discord will know this means the user in question is no longer in the server, meaning they no longer work with QI in any capacity, oftentimes actually being banned from the server due to, quote, misinformation. So after the issues with the keys had been resolved and people got into the game, it was clear that development had not been going to plan thus far. Despite the non-disclosure agreement, people were keen to share their opinions online, even if it risked them a ban. It was rare to see a particularly good word spoken about the state of the closed alpha experience, unless the good word included a hope for the future of the game. Maybe it will get there one day. What they had so far was many, many years away from even mirroring what the DayZ mod had delivered from a single developer 8 years prior from the standpoint of a fun game to play. The only footage that can be found online of Dead Matter is sourced officially from QI themselves or special partnered content creators who were given permission to stream and post videos for specific periods of time during the test, and the comments under each of these videos mirror the sentiment of those who could not speak out publicly. The game was not worth the wait, and at this rate may never be. Now, to address non-disclosure agreements, I can't say that they're not useful in certain limited situations. What I can say is that in gaming, they're often used in a way that hurts you way more than helps you. The closed alpha had reportedly over 60,000 users, and there is no way you will ever contain all of those opinions or prevent people from leaking footage. Having the NDA, however, shows that you are trying to hide something. When you claim transparency and then your actions betray you, people will notice, and at that point, you might as well have taken the negative publicity for an alpha game having alpha game problems, as opposed to an alpha game having alpha game problems, as well as claims of silencing people's opinions for a product that wouldn't even exist without their patronage. Moving beyond this, the game has been in development for 2 years since then, and not a whole lot has changed. There are also a lot of conspiracy theories in the Dead Matter community regarding where the money went and how it may have been misplaced. For example, some people are convinced that Nick Zorko, the CEO, bought himself a mansion, which I did my usual checks for, which include mortgage and land parcel ownership searches, speaking to current and former employees, and other means, which turned up absolutely nothing. Dead Matter's problems have nothing to do with someone being malicious or misplacing the funds. The issue is, has, and always will be complete and utter incompetence of management. The studio has faced such a high turnover in staff, as well as such a huge shift in game design and reworking old game design, rewriting old code, that is nowhere near launch despite being in development for over 5 years since the original Kickstarter. The public-facing message from QI seems to be that they are heading towards an early access release on Steam, which has been subjected to almost as many delays as the original closed alpha test was, and now is coming sometime in 2023. This brings with it the ability for them to start making money again, selling access to the game, and an end to the non-disclosure agreement, which lets people show the state of Dead Matter without risking a lawsuit or having some kind of special permission. QI took on new studio management in September of 2021 who made sweeping changes to the way things were being handled, including closing all of development during January 2022, using that time to restructure workflows and organize the studio in a more modern manner. The letter penned by this new studio head reads as if things had been run by cowboys for the previous 4 years, and he had to step in and add some order to the chaos. During this letter, Derek recognized the number one problem with development thus far had been a lack of clear direction, which is definitely not something you want to be hearing from somebody 4 years into development. On top of this, he touched upon the fact that many employees had changed over the years. What he didn't mention is that the actual number one problem with the studio was management he was now part of, and he was about to be the cause of multiple other employees leaving the studio as well. According to these people I interviewed, the management of QI has always been troublesome. Nick spent too much time and money where it wasn't required, such as hiring office space for a mostly international and remote team, constant rewrites of code that didn't need to be rewritten, removing of code, art, or features that were made by team members who left the project, which was a frequent occurrence, hiring of and promoting of people who were not fit for the position, and much, much more. While this was supposed to be Nick's vision, he would often disappear from meetings, stop replying to urgent messages regarding issues or direction for the game, and instead work on programming or reprogramming systems that were not a priority or wouldn't even make it into the game, while also constantly making public promises of release dates that were never even discussed with the team, leaving them to find out only when they browsed the public Discord server and knew that the date was impossible to meet based on the current state of the game internally. When they tried to bring this up with Nick, he was often dismissive, sometimes abusive and angry. Multiple employees told me it was commonplace for Nick to scream at people during meetings, especially if they were critical of something relating to the game or his actions. That is, of course, if he was in meetings at all. This means management was left up to whoever was his right hand at the time. The two that were talked about had different issues. One of them was prior to the restructuring we just went over that happened in late 2021, and this manager was known as Metamoth. He was simply too inexperienced for the job, which was not just studio manager, but also that of the lead level designer. The level design that, of course, when he left, was part of a complete recreation yet again, because it was so bad. The situation as it was described to me was that experienced team members who knew what they were doing and worked on a lot of games were constantly being mismanaged by Nick and Metamoth, making them perform tasks in ways that didn't make sense, that the team knew would be a waste of resources, but knew better than to push back as they had seen people be mocked, laughed at, and fired for doing so previously. On top of this, due to Nick's propensity for making promises to the fans about release dates without consulting anybody within the team, the employees were under constant crunch, so much so that management would literally track their Steam profiles to criticize them if they'd been playing too many games in their spare time and not coming into work instead, commenting on their relationship status and how they needed to focus more on work, trying to manipulate them to stay for longer hours with remarks like, "You were like a brother or sister to me," if they were to be found leaving while others were still crunching, or receiving work texts at 4 AM, calls late into the evening, and much, much more. On top of this, despite the terms being agreed upon during interviews before they were joining the team, it wasn't uncommon for people to be waiting weeks or months for their pay. And if all that wasn't bad enough, then I'll read you a quote from one of my interviews. After leaving QI, my co-workers and I found some interesting portions of the, at the time, recent blogs that related to us or others, essentially blaming the game's issues on past members. These blogs were all written by the studio manager at the time. I'd like to also mention that all the issues mentioned in these blogs were never brought up with me or the rest of the team because, like I said before, the studio manager never gave feedback or took steps to fix the issues, and Nick seemed to be completely unaware of them. When we did bring up these blogs to Nick, he was furious in our DMs, saying this was, quote, unacceptable, I can't believe this happened, this is disgusting behavior, etc. Unfortunately, nothing ever happened to the studio manager other than a slap on the wrist and a lame, forced apology. As a result of this, most of the experienced team who could have made the game left for greener pastures, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy of digging the game into a deeper hole, as with each person leaving, Nick or the studio head would decide that their work needed to be changed or removed entirely, wasting more and more resources. After this, in late 2021, they replaced the studio manager with Derek, whom was an entirely different manager. Many employees had hope that with this new hire, the tide would shift in favour of a more professional work environment that would be competently handled for once. And they were wrong. Inexperienced, passive-aggressive, rude, and a yes-man for Nick is how the new studio head is described by many. When speaking to the unnamed sources, I asked each of them if the game was a scam. They all said no, but it would likely have been a better result if it had been one. The money has been spent on good faith creation of Dead Matter, just in a way that is so terribly misguided that most of it has been wasted. I also asked if they believe the game will ever fully release. This was when each of them told me a different worded version of no. They all believe that money is getting tighter, which is why Nick was constantly stressed about paying out employees what they were owed. His lack of ambition in replacing the senior staff that himself and management alienated, causing them to leave the company, as well as constantly trying to rush this early access release for a game that he knows is years away from being ready for public consumption. The recent push for the early access Steam launch likely comes out of necessity and not because the game is ready. If the game launches into early access, the shroud of a non-disclosure agreement will do them no further good, and the negative reviews will tank the game's reputation more than it already has been, while not bringing in any sufficient sum of money to turn the tide, as money has never been the issue. In fact, Dead Matter had a budget infinitely bigger than anyone could have hoped for, and orders of magnitude higher than what the original Kickstarter pitch claimed to need. What many people do not know is that Dead Matter and QI as a studio are living on borrowed time and have been for a while. The crowdfunding money ran out long ago. The majority of it was wasted in code, art, employees that have since come and gone. The question people should have been asking, how do you keep expanding your team while having no source of income? The answer, according to the people I interviewed, is that QI received heavy investment from none other than everyone's favorite mega corporation from China, Tencent. Now, this is not out of the ordinary for gaming, as Tencent have been doing their very best to gobble up as many Western development studios and games as they possibly can, big or small. For QI, though, this investment came with strings attached, and those strings have been cut by the incompetent management. The development of Dead Matter has seen no significant progress, the money Tencent handed over has been wasted, and is mostly ran out. Tencent is angry and will hand over no further investment. Therefore, according to some sources, QI have fired most of their art team, is no longer actively hiring despite publicly appearing to do so, and pushing out this early access client despite knowing it is not ready for public consumption to just keep the lights on at the studio and continue to try to deliver on Dead Matter as they promised. The new studio manager Derek, who joined at the back end of 2021, left another company who he ran into the ground and was on the verge of bankruptcy to do so. Joining QI, he was supposed to be the literal savior of the whole game and the development studio. He was even paid more money than the CEO, a number that people find ridiculous, considering he is now leaving the company just over a year later in a worse state than how he found it. This leaves management entirely up to Nick. The guy whose only experience in game dev comes from making Gary's mod servers and seems not to have learned much about managing a studio while having done so in the last 4 years. So many people requested this video, as Dead Matter has an incredibly high number of disgruntled backers and ex-employees. However, unlike in many of the other Kickstarter to court series, they seem to suffer from incompetence and not from malevolence. The only court that Dead Matter is going to, at least for now, is the court of public opinion. There doesn't seem to be any misappropriation of funds from my investigation. They are offering refunds to people who back the game and are unhappy with current development, and they're still actively trying to work on an eventual release. Although in my opinion, it's unlikely to materialize in any way that delivers on what people got excited about all those years ago. And if people were to ask for refunds in any sizable amount, it's very likely the studio would straight up fold, as they have no income source, no investment source, and development is draining what little remains in the coffers. Some of the ex-employees told me that they were waiting for thousands of dollars, some of them tens of thousands of dollars worth of back pay that in some circumstances is still unpaid. So to recap what exactly went wrong. At the time of crowdfunding, the CEO Nicholas Sorko was a 20-year-old with no commercial game development experience, no shipped games, and he was just a hobbyist modder. This was the least of his problems, as the CEO doesn't need to be writing code, although if they got less funding he would have needed to be a more integral part, so that experience would have helped. The issue is he has even less experience in running a multi-million-dollar software studio with dozens of employees to manage and picking the right people to put in the right management positions. The project started out with claims of transparency and ended with a legally binding document to prevent transparency due to the knowledge the game was a mess and people shouldn't be talking about it. They started out with a promise to never ban or silence the fans who gave them money to pursue the dream, and ended with a community where users are scared to share their criticism for fear of reprisals. They started out with delivery estimates that have been missed by years, with many more years to go before the deliverables are met for even the initial vision back in 2017. They started out independent and ended up suckling from the money tap of Tencent and still couldn't leverage that into a competently run studio or any kind of minimum viable product to maintain funding. Overall, they failed to create what they sold to people, at least for now. And we can assume from the constant delays and the illuminating employee testimony that the CEO didn't handle the job well, which means ill intention is not required for money to have been wasted. If the CEO ran away with the money or bought a house, that's of course fraud. He didn't do that. But he did waste people's money on incompetent management, and the result is very nearly the same. Whichever way you look at it, whether it was by malevolence or incompetence, all the money's gone, and there's a very slim chance that people get the game they paid for. The game is almost unrecognizable in terms of scope compared to their initial vision, with the map being stripped down in both quality and size for the upcoming early access rush launch. And according to every source I interviewed, not even one of them had any hope that this game would be finished one day. All these things and more have given people reason to lose all faith in the studio, and therefore the game that they were supposed to deliver. I can't personally blame the CEO, because all he did was have a dream to deliver a game, and then people were naive enough to give him the money to try, without looking into his personal experience or understanding just how hard it is to make a good product. Realistically, the biggest studios in the world, with the most experience you can possibly have, with funding beyond your wildest imagination, can make bad games, can make failures. So expecting a massive, ambitious game to come out of a studio without any of these things is unreasonable to begin with. That would make you the exception, not the rule, and something you shouldn't really be betting on happening. It is not a crime to think you can do something and then fail, even if I personally believe you should not try to fulfill your dreams by standing on the shoulders, or more aptly the stacks of cash, from those who lack the information to make the decision to let you do so.
I'm Richard Garriott, known to some of you as Lord British.
So Cronos The New Dawn official gameplay reveal trailer just dropped on IGN. And the way the top comment is describing this is Silent Hill and Dead Space had a baby. Can't wait. Let's see. Let's see. I will judge this baby for myself.
Focus your attention. What do you see? Giant. Sleeping. Again. Animals.
I'm already into the vibe. Bloober team. Yeah, I see the Dead Space. I can see that.
Stay focused. Stay cautious. That is our calling.
Oh, that. Okay, that's trippy. Oh, they can like merge with dead bodies to get bigger and grow. That's cool.
Good thing I was around. Traveler.
Still coming this year too. Golly. I will say Team Bloober used to be known as like sort of a B tier dev. Like they did a good job for what they had, you know, but their games always landed in that like low 70s range and they just never really popped off. They were always just kind of clunky and didn't really flow well. They also always had like weird visual impairments, let's just say. But they seemingly, after the Silent Hill thing, they've just figured it out, because this looks awesome. I also love the idea of, I wonder how you deal with it, but like this guy dies, falls to the ground, and then other, you know, monsters come and can like merge with them to grow bigger and stronger and upgrade to like the brute class or the whatever classes are above those. And I like that. I like that idea. I think that's interesting. I wonder if there's a way to deal with it where it's like, you know, maybe you have fire grenades and you burn the body and then they can't do it, or like how you go about it. Maybe you have to go and stomp their head or something like that, straight out of Dead Space. But I do think that adds an interesting little wrinkle, because I can already imagine there being like boss encounters or something where there's a bunch of grunt little enemies that are running towards you, and you're incentivized to kill them separate from each other. So this guy drops, you pull the other one farther away from him, you drop him there. That way the boss can't just come and merge with like 5 of them at once and get, you know, totally healed up or whatever it might do. So there's all sorts of interesting little gameplay things you could do with that concept as well. I like that. I mean, other than that, just based on the gameplay footage I'm seeing, it does look like, you know, we have some platforming type of stuff. This trippy, like, yeah, this right here. This seems interesting. The like reverse gravity field, Gravitron. That seems interesting. Like you could have some trippy environments like that. But more than anything, it seems like it's going to be a third-person shooter, which is fine. But when you're a third-person shooter in a game like this, I think it's really important to have really tight gameplay. And if you don't have a lot of enemy variety, you run into the Callisto Protocol phenomenon, which is just that things get kind of repetitive and they can get boring, because especially a lot of games like this, they don't have a lot of like cutscene exposition. They don't have a lot of dialogue exposition. It's usually environmental storytelling, that type of thing, which is great. I love that. But it means if the gameplay isn't keeping you engaged, it's really easy to just get bored. So, you know, the standard will be high for that. But what I'm seeing looks interesting. They've nailed the ambiance. They've nailed, yeah, look at that. It's graphically really, really solid. And it seems way less clunky than previous Team Bloober projects. So I'm intrigued, but I would keep an eye on like enemy variety and stuff like that. I think that's going to make or break it. But I like what I'm seeing. It seems to have potential. Interesting. Thank you, Burn Bread, for the membership. Thank you. Lucio Carver. I need a story trailer to see if it's worthy. Story trailer would be nice. It might also just be one of those things where they're like, ooh, it's a mystery. You've got to save your other shipmates or whatever it is, you know. Does anyone know what Zaraza means? Oh, it means infection in Russian. Disease or infection or plague or something like that. Okay. Okay. That makes sense, if that's what that is. Because it definitely seems like something's going around. I'll tell you that much. Tell you that much. I think also one of the things I like about this style of game, at least as it is captured here, is the fact that there's no over, like, abundance in the UI. It's one thing that drives me crazy with a lot of modern games is they just have like, oh, you have the mini map over here. You have your health bars over here. You have your stamina points up here. Your skill points are also displayed up here. And then you have your ability wheel right here. It drives me crazy. Whereas one thing I love about Dead Space is that like on the back of the backpack, you have, or the suit, you have an indication of the player character's health. You don't need tons of UI. There's an actual word for it. Does anyone in chat know the word? I forget. There's a term, diegetic. Diegetic. That's it. Diegetic UI components inhabit both the game's story and space, and characters within the game are aware of its components. Even though they exist within the game's story and space, poorly considered diegetic components are still capable of distracting or frustrating players. Basically, it's just that type of thing where you have the maybe it's something as simple as you know, you have a revolver, and when you aim the revolver, you fire the shots, and then there's a button to open it, like X to open it to see how many rounds you have left, X to reload again, or you can just hit B and it closes back up. So you can check how much ammo you have in the game without having to look at a menu or anything, you know? Yeah, it's diabetic UI. Diabetic UI. Yeah. I love that kind of thing. I am very frustrated by the overabundance of UI stuff. He took my thing. Red flag, red flag.
guess so, yeah.
I'm about to use the Scar, man. Man, I'm about to use the M14. You're making that thing look so good. Hold up.
I mean, the Scar's fun. I like the Scar.
It's the M14 time.
Hi, my name is Tony, and this is Every Frame of Painting, where I analyze film form. Today's movie is The Imposter from 2012, directed by Bart Layton. If you haven't seen it, please read nothing more. Don't even look up what genre this thing is. Just close this video, browse over to Netflix, and watch it, because I'm going to spoil everything.
You have 5 seconds. Like poverty. 250s or something. Oh, I have like a bunch of poverty guns on me.
Nade come from?
Where
Wait, what came from?
Where did that fire nade come from?
I don't know, man. I was still confused as well.
February 7, 1981, the Tupolev Tu-104 from the 25th Naval Aviation Division of the Soviet Pacific Fleet lined up on the main runway of the military airfield Pushkin and prepared to take off. It was a normal winter day with a slight crosswind and a little snow, but nothing serious enough to cancel the flight. As soon as permission to take off was granted, the aircraft began the run and soon lifted into the air. But just 8 seconds after the aircraft became airborne, all of a sudden the Tu-104 crashed into the ground 1500 meters from the end of the runway. The huge explosion that followed left no survivors among those on board the aircraft. For the Soviet jetliners Tupolev Tu-104, the disaster at Pushkin airfield became the very last accident in their history, after which they were permanently retired from service. But the main reason the tragedy at Pushkin airfield went down in history was not because it had ended the career of the first Soviet commercial jetliner, but because the single crash had almost entirely beheaded the Soviet Pacific Fleet. And that day, in just a few seconds, the Soviet Navy lost 16 admirals and generals, including the commander of the Pacific Fleet himself. Whether you like it or not, but people who serve in the armed forces are not exactly equal. At least not in the way we have become used to in civil organizations. In its very essence, armed forces, no matter the country, are a strong hierarchical system, and one person's value within the system is reflected by their military rank. Sure, there always will be some exceptions, but as a general rule, the high-ranking officers possess higher-level skills and expertise, which make them more valuable in comparison to the lower-ranking servicemen. Thus, for the armed forces, the loss of the high-ranking officers is always an exceptional occurrence, since the effect of such a loss will always have a negative, if not devastating effect. But it is one thing when the commanders are lost due to enemy actions, like for example the death of Hisoroku Yamamoto as a result of the exceptional operation by the US Army Air Force, and it is quite another when the enemy has nothing to do with it. And there may be a minor difference if the reason was due to a bad weather, human error, or a freak accident, like for instance the death of Romanian Major General Alexandru Ioanitu, who was walking around on the airfield waiting for his plane to get ready, and while being lost in thought, accidentally stepped into the aircraft's rotating propeller. But arguably nothing can compare to the accident that happened in the Soviet Union in 1981, when just a single airplane crash killed 44 Navy servicemen, including the commander of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, Admiral Emil Spiridonov. The awful accident itself was already an enormous blow for the Soviet Navy, but finding out the reasons that caused the accident simply doubled the shock of the tragedy itself. On February 1st, 1981, the high-ranking officers of the main Soviet fleets arrived in Leningrad for an annual general meeting. During the whole week that followed, the fleet commanders were reporting about the current condition and readiness of their fleets to hold the fight against the evil capitalist bloodsuckers. Based on the reports, the admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov, pointed out that among all the Soviet fleets, the highest level of proficiency and competence was demonstrated by the command of the Pacific Fleet. Since it was one of the most important and powerful fleets in the Soviet Navy, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Spiridonov, and his officers received personal gratitude from Admiral Gorshkov for such an outstanding service. Being acknowledged by the chief commander himself was a great honor, so the Pacific Fleet officers, despite the upcoming long flight to Vladivostok, to the very east of the Soviet Union, were in a great mood. Although Pushkin was a military airfield, on February 7th it was a bit crowded in the airport's departure area. Navy admirals, army generals, and various Communist Party officials were there, still discussing with excitement the results of the general meeting they took part in. There was even a special outdoor area cleared of snow made for them so they could better observe the departing airplanes. According to eyewitnesses, everything that day looked quite ordinary, except maybe the takeoff run of the Pacific Fleet's Tu-104 that seemed to take a bit longer than usual, but in the end the plane nevertheless took off in the air. But as they recalled later, the aircraft, instead of slowly decreasing in size as it would normally do while flying away from the airfield, suddenly hung ominously in the blue sky like a huge cross, and then, rolling to the right, crashed on the ground. A huge explosion then rose into the sky. The aircraft's fuel tanks were fully loaded for the long flight, and 30 tons of jet fuel, after exploding, were fiercely burning for yet another hour. The crowd in the departure area rushed through the deep snow to the crash site, but the strong flames did not allow them to approach the wreckage and help the passengers and the crew in any way. Only one person was found alive, having been thrown out of the cockpit through the glass in the nose of the aircraft. Unfortunately, the severeness of his injuries didn't leave him any chance of survival, and he died on the way to the hospital. The plane crash killed all 50 people on board, among which were 12 colonels and captains of the first rank, as well as 16 admirals and generals, including the commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Emil Spiridonov. At first, it was simply impossible to believe what had happened. To better understand the extent of the tragedy, during all the years of World War II, the USSR lost only 4 admirals, 6 years of war and 4 admirals, and here in just a blink of an eye, 16. In a single moment, the Soviet Navy lost almost the entire command of the Pacific Fleet. It was an unbelievable loss for the Soviet Navy, and the first reaction in the headquarters was, "It's a war." The Soviets decided that the plane was destroyed as a result of the enemy's special operation to kill all the commanding officers so that the Pacific Fleet wouldn't be able to withhold the powerful attack that would obviously be coming soon. So the very next moment, all Soviet military units in the Pacific were put on full alert, ready to meet the enemy. But time was passing and the enemy was not coming. While the Pacific Fleet was waiting for a fight and the soldiers of the Pushkin Airfield Guard were searching nearby woods and fields for any top-secret documents that might have flown away from the crash site, the Soviet Navy command realized more and more clearly that the possibility of the enemy bringing the explosives to the heavily guarded military airfield, where every soldier went through a thorough verification process, was extremely low. So the conclusion was made: if the plane crash wasn't from the actions from the outside, it was from the inside then. An internal sabotage. One of our own set the crash. Someone who would benefit from the death of the Pacific Fleet commander. To take his place, for example. But who? All of Admiral Spiridonov's deputies died with him in the plane crash. Or did they? When checking the passenger list, it was suddenly found that Vice Admiral Rudolf Golosov, the Chief of Staff of the Pacific Fleet and the first candidate to replace Admiral Spiridonov, was not on board the crashed plane. It turned out that at the very last moment, Golosov refused to fly with Admiral Spiridonov and the rest of the officers. Was it because Golosov knew the plane would crash? And where is he? Admiral Golosov didn't board the plane, but he couldn't be found at the Pushkin airfield either. For a moment, it seemed that investigators had caught a promising trace. Although Vice Admiral Golosov indeed didn't fly on the plane to Vladivostok, it became clear relatively quickly that he had nothing to do with the crash. The thing is that Rudolf Golosov, before being transferred to the Pacific Fleet, had served for some time in the command of the Northern Fleet. and his daughter still lived there with her family. Taking advantage of attending the meeting in Leningrad, the Vice Admiral asked his commander Admiral Spiridonov, way ahead of the trip, for permission to visit his daughter during the weekend after the meeting, and then he would return to Vladivostok by taking the commercial flight. Admiral Spiridonov replied that it would all depend on the results of the general meeting, and he would give his decision then. Since the meeting was a big success, Spiridonov allowed Golosov to visit his daughter, but their final conversation was just a couple of hours before the disaster, and that is why Vice Admiral Golosov was still on the passenger list. In the morning of February 7th, Golosov flew to the Murmansk together with the command of the Northern Fleet, not even realizing that it saved his life. As he later recalled in his book, while in the middle of the 4-hour drive to the small town to meet his daughter, a police car caught up to him asking to return immediately to the Northern Fleet headquarters. Golosov spoke with Admiral Gorshkov over the phone, and it was a huge shock for him when he learned that all his comrades had died in the plane crash. The shock was no less when his friend, who worked in counterintelligence, privately told him later that for some time Golosov had seriously been considered as a suspect in the death of the Pacific Fleet Command. But if the enemy had nothing to do with the crash and it was not sabotaged, what was it then? Airplane malfunction? Human error? But that would be impossible, since the Soviet pilots don't make mistakes and the Soviet airplanes are the most reliable in the world, at least officially. But the data from the aircraft's black box seemed to bluntly ignore the desires of the Soviet propaganda. From the point of safety and reliability, the Tupolev Tu-104, which the command of the Pacific Fleet used to fly on, was certainly not the best choice, to put it mildly. Very mildly. Developed in record time, the first Soviet jetliner, the Tupolev Tu-104, was of course a huge technological accomplishment for the Soviet Union. But the Russian development, driven more by political rather than rational decisions, led the plane to have a long list of flaws. Sure, when building something that is the very first of its kind, mistakes are almost inevitable. That's just a normal part of technological progress. But the problem was that being fully aware of all the Tu-104 flaws and the aircraft's extremely awful accident rate, in fact the worst among all the Soviet commercial airplanes that ever existed, the Soviet government stubbornly refused to retire the aircraft from service. Although the production of the aircraft was cancelled in 1960, the Tupolev Tu-104 continued to fly for more than 20 years, regularly enlarging the death toll of its victims. The last straw for civil aviation was the aircraft disaster in March 1979, when yet another Tu-104 crashed not far from Moscow and the aircraft was then removed from service. But not entirely. The Soviet military decided to keep their Tu-104s. But the thing is that even the military Tu-104s being used at the beginning of the 1980s, from a technological perspective, differed little to nothing from the late 1950s when those planes were built and put into service. Poor radio and navigation equipment, multiple technological flaws, heavy on controls, the Tupolev Tu-104 has always been a difficult aircraft to fly, whose safety largely depended not on the airplane performance itself, but rather on the skills and experience of any particular aircrew. Going back to the disaster at Pushkin, perhaps at the time it was difficult to find a better fit for the old Tu-104 than Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Ilyushin. More than 8,000 flight hours in total, almost 6,000 of which were on the Tupolev Tu-104. Highly experienced pilot Anatoly Ilyushin for several years was the captain of the airplane that carried the command of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. So was the crash at Pushkin his fault? The problem is that, like most of the accidents in the Soviet Union, whether civil or military, the disaster in Pushkin was immediately classified. Only the general conclusion of the investigation conducted by the Ministry of Defense, released almost 2 years after the accident, was more or less official. One of the official conclusions was that the plane became airborne at a speed of 40 km per hour less than the required takeoff speed. But is it possible that Ilyushin, who had 17 years of flight experience on the Tu-104, had made such a stupid mistake? Moreover, why didn't the co-pilot or anyone else in the cockpit notice that and prevent the fatal mistake? According to the flight regulations, while on the takeoff run, the Tu-104 pilot must reach the speed of at least 220 km per hour and then slowly raise the nose of the aircraft by 6 degrees. After completing the initial pitch of the nose gear, the Tu-104 would get airborne on its own and would gradually continue to climb. But according to Admiral Golosov, something weird happened during the Tu-104's takeoff at Pushkin. In his book, Golosov claims that the commander of the Soviet Naval Aviation, General Mironenko, showed him the data from the aircraft's black box after the investigation was complete. The flight recorder indeed had registered that the aircraft took off at a speed of 185 km per hour instead of the required 220. But what is interesting is that the aircraft's angle of attack was much higher than the required 6 degrees, and even more importantly, the flight recorder did not register any pressure on the yokes when the Tu-104 got airborne. In simple words, according to Golosov, it was not the pilot who lifted the plane into the air. But if it was not Ilyushin, then who or what? When trying to understand the reasons behind pretty much any event that happened in the Soviet Union, it is always important to understand the, let's call it, peculiarities of life in the USSR. The Soviet Union was in every sense quite an unusual country. Thus, for most of the people who were fortunate to be born outside of the USSR, some events might make no sense at all. In fact, one might say that making no sense would be one of the main peculiarities of the Soviet Union. Sure, from a scientific and technological perspective, the USSR was indeed one of the most powerful countries in the world. Make no mistake, the list of technological achievements of the Soviet Union is impressive in comparison to any of the countries that existed at the time. But when making the conclusion about the greatness of the USSR, it is quite often that people forget or simply are not aware of the price that ordinary Soviet citizens had to pay for such greatness. The impressive list of technological accomplishments made by the greatest country in the world, as most of the Russians still think, would make a completely different impression if, for example, you start adding some other, less impressive achievements that most of you won't even think of, since they have been taken for granted. Like, for example, the year 1969, when the Soviet Union launched the first factory producing toilet paper. So the greatest country in the world has already built and tested nuclear bomb, launched the Sputnik, completed the first manned journey into outer space, built the first supersonic jetliner, but still couldn't produce toilet paper. And 1969 was not the year of solving the problem of toilet paper, but just the year of launching a single factory in a country with a population of 130 million people. To be fair, the availability of toilet paper in the Soviet Union has always been an issue until the very last day of the existence of the USSR, making it yet another item in the long list of the so-called deficit goods, a word familiar to every Soviet citizen no matter the age or place of birth. A catastrophically ineffective Soviet economy led to the situation that most of the consumer goods were either non-existent or were poor quality, and even those most of the time would be either hard or even impossible to buy. That applied to pretty much everything, whether it's a car, TV set, furniture, shoes, or even food. Of course, for the high-ranking Communist Party members, this problem didn't exist, since they received the deficit goods from the special stores, which regular citizens were not allowed in. The Soviet people were joking that the USSR was the only country in the world where everyone is equal. It's just some people are more equal than others. The situation with the availability of consumer goods in the stores was somewhat better in large cities such as Moscow, Leningrad or Kiev, but for the remaining 90% of the country, the situation was simply awful. When trying to get some deficit products, it was quite often that the Soviet people had to take a train and travel to, let's say, Moscow to do groceries. There was even a popular riddle in the Soviet time. What is long, green and smells like sausage? The answer is a passenger train. The thing is that the travelers returning from Moscow with bags packed with various food items, most of the time sausages, provided passenger cars with quite peculiar and distinctive smell. That is why these trains were often called sausage trains. And I'm talking here not about Moscow's suburbs, but about the cities that are more than 1,000 kilometers away, such as Kursk or Samara. Just so you understand, population-wise, those are cities that are comparable to Miami and Manchester. So going back to the Pushkin airfield in 1981, one might say that the military Tu-104 with Navy officers who flew from the far east of the Soviet Union to Leningrad was in a way a sausage plane. While working through the version of the pilot's mistake that possibly caused the crash of the Tu-104, it was discovered all of a sudden that Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Ilyushin, the pilot of the Admiral's airplane, long before the disaster at Pushkin had sent a complaint to the political department of the Soviet Navy, reporting that his plane was constantly flying overloaded while transporting furniture, refrigerators, washers, china sets and even spare parts for the Admiral's Moskvich. But Ilyushin's complaint remained unanswered. Nobody dared to question Admiral Spiridonov. Such facts, as well as the testimony of some eyewitnesses at Pushkin, were signaling more and more clearly about the cause of the disaster, which many had thought of from the very beginning, but didn't dare to voice it. The fact is that the officers of the Pacific Fleet decided to take full advantage of their working trip to the so-called second capital of the Soviet Union. Of course, such a trip for them was not the first, but this time the shopping tour, for some unknown reasons, completely spiraled out of control. As General Viktor Sakharin recalled after the crash, the mess when loading the aircraft was pure chaos. A bunch of admirals giving commands to load their multiple purchases, the aircrew trying to bring the loading process into order, but admirals rudely telling the pilots that they are just drivers here and they should know their place. The co-pilot and the captain argued again, after which several admirals had fired, deranked, retired, and verbally humiliated the pilots. Who is a co-pilot for the Soviet admiral? Nothing, just an insect, even the captain of the airplane, albeit a lieutenant colonel. Moreover, the commanders rarely flew home from the meetings sober. Admirals shoved in the airplane everything they were able to find and buy in Leningrad, starting with the furniture, TVs, ceiling lamps, china, and ending with regular oranges. According to some accounts, as a result, the aircraft became heavily overloaded. But to make it even worse because of the disorder while loading, the cargo was placed in the aircraft unevenly, overloading the rear part of the plane, which in turn shifted the center of gravity to the rear. Of course, today it is impossible to find out why the captain of the aircraft agreed to take off in such conditions. As General Sakharin once said, it's hard to say what would have happened to Anatoly Ilyushin and his aircrew had he refused to fly. I suppose that in the best case scenario, all the aircrew members would become retirees right on the airplane. And it is hard to disagree with him. High-ranking officers in the Soviet Army and Navy had powers so great that they indeed could ruin someone's career or even life in an instant. General Sakharin believed that the pilot, knowing about the overweight, probably hoped that he would be able to keep the aircraft on the takeoff run in a 3-point position until the required takeoff speed or even slightly higher, after which he would carefully raise the nose of the aircraft, and with a small angle of attack and a speed higher than required, he would be able to slowly lift the aircraft in the air. There was roughly a 10% margin in the possible shifting of the Tu-104 center of gravity before the critical levels on which the plane becomes uncontrolled. According to General Sakharin, it's difficult, but they had to perform such a takeoff from time to time when their Tu-16 bombers were overweight, which were quite similar to Tu-104. And he thinks that Ilyushin was hoping to deceive the wrongly loaded cargo by using such a takeoff technique. But there was another thing. Right before the flight, Admiral Spiridonov managed to get 2 huge rolls of printing paper for the Pacific Fleet's newspaper. Each roll weighed roughly 500 kilograms. It is believed that these rolls, when loaded on board, were not properly secured, and during the acceleration of the takeoff run, they all of a sudden rolled back in the cargo bay, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity further to the rear into the critically dangerous level. As a result of this rapid shift, the aircraft raised the nose itself, which in turn created the lift on the wings sufficient enough to get the aircraft airborne. But due to insufficient speed and high angle of attack, the plane stalled and a few seconds later fell to the ground. Unfortunately, there is nothing that the pilots could do in such a situation. As Admiral Golosov wrote in his book, officers jumped into the cars and rushed to the crash site. Alas, the heat of blazing jet fuel did not let them get closer. Bright orange flames quickly devoured the remains of the people. Only the oranges remained alive, rolling out from the burning debris, brightly orange like little shards of the flame. All 50 people on board were killed as a result of the plane crash. 44 of them were Navy servicemen and 6 were civilians. Among them was Admiral Spiridonov's wife and some other people whom Admiral Spiridonov allowed to fly on his plane, which was a flagrant violation of the Minister of Defense order that strictly prohibited civilians from flying on military flights. But apparently Admiral Spiridonov here again decided that rules are not for admirals. Soon after the accident, the main Soviet military newspaper Red Star published a small note far in the corner on the 3rd page saying that the group of the Soviet admirals, officers and other servicemen of the Pacific Fleet died in the air crash. The Ministry of Defense and Political Department of the Soviet Army and Navy expressed condolences to the relatives of the perished. The note also listed the names of 3 admirals who died in the crash. And that's all, nothing more than that. The Soviet Union didn't even notice the loss of 50 people. Like most of the accidents in the USSR, the disaster in Pushkin was immediately classified and remains so to this day. Most of the perished in the accident were quietly buried in a common grave in Leningrad, where a small memorial was later erected. Interestingly enough, the widows of the Navy officers received an official notice of the deaths of their husbands only in 1997, 6 years after the Soviet Union had collapsed. And a year later, in 1998, to the inscription on the memorial saying to Navy servicemen of the Pacific Fleet was added who died serving on duty on February 7, 1981. Of course, no one would like the inscription on the memorial saying to servicemen who died while doing groceries. But the problem is that such an approach and total secrecy significantly reduce the chances of learning from mistakes, which doesn't help by any means to avoid such accidents in the future. With the total secrecy in the USSR and then Russian Federation, it's hard to say how many similar accidents had occurred since. Unfortunately, we only know about those that were impossible to hide. Like for example the 1996 crash of the military aircraft Antonov An-12, in which 17 people died, including the commander of the Leningrad military district, General Sergei Stylized. It is believed that the cause of the disaster was that the aircrew was forced by the general to take off in the overloaded plane in harsh weather conditions. The crashed aircraft, in addition to the military cargo, was also transporting various construction materials for the General Seleznev's house, as well as his personal car. It is well known that obtaining enormous power may blind and change people. Unfortunately, when it comes to the USSR and modern Russia, it is quite often that this problem gets to the extent that those possessing powers not only reject the basic rules of human ethics, but even the laws of physics. And the worst part is that most of the time the final bill for such negligence is not only paid by themselves, but shared with innocent people too. And that's this story. If you like aviation and stories like this, hit the like button to support new episodes on this channel. Special thank you to all who support Paper Skies on Patreon. That's all for now, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye. July 9, 1960.
Oh my god, content cop on H3H3? H3H3. I was right. Like, I mean, this is always what happens. I heard iDubbbz is doing a content cop again. I hope it's about me, man. If it is, then I'll finally have some fucking content. Big Hassan? Probably not going to be on Hassan. I think probably H3. H3 probably be... What was the reason? It'll take me a minute. Do you want me to actually explain the reason why? So, the reasons why I thought it was H3H3 is because iDubbbz, I think, has gone through a long period of time of trying to reinvent himself as a content creator that is not problematic and trying to go beyond his previous past. And so because of that, I thought that, you know, really attacking somebody who was attacking one of the most, like, kind of influential or opinionated people that's part of that group, who would be Hassan, right? Basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so it would be a strategic advantage for him to do that because it would help him align with a group of people that he's been trying to gain favor with. Ethan is like a very interesting situation where, like, Ethan is not really representative of like a very strong political viewpoint, but he has an anti-viewpoint. So you can go against a person like that more easily without necessarily attacking other people that are aligned with him, because his perspective on it was much more circumstantial around repudiating what Hassan was doing rather than necessarily pushing his own personal agenda. I'm not going to watch it today. It's a big video. I'm sure Ian worked really hard on it. Will I watch it? Before, look, Hassan, I don't know what he's going to say, but if before he even has the chance to create the fucking narrative that I'm not going to watch the video, I'm going to watch it. So, because you know he's going to try to pull that shit.
Don't tell me what Asmon is saying. Asmon is saying China started this war because they steal and copy products. Stop! Stop! We're talking about people who are adults, who are fucking PhDs and famous economists who are dropping the ball and failing to comprehend what is actually happening, what is actually unfolding in front of their eyes, and you're fucking telling me about Asmongold? What the fuck does he know about global trade? Shut up!
UK Supreme Court says that only women born as female will have access to women-only services such as female-only prisons, housing for abused women, and not anyone who's changed their gender. This is like somebody telling you that, in fact, a rectangle is not a triangle. And, like, think about if there has been a geometry debate for the last 10 years, and there's been a group of people that have been just adamant, militant, vicious, aggressive, out for blood to tell you that a rectangle is a fucking triangle. And finally, somebody says, no, it's not. It's actually a fucking rectangle. This is a huge victory for, what do you call it? A huge victory for common sense. Massive victory for common sense, especially in the UK. You don't get a whole lot of those. And so the Supreme Court backs bylaw. Let's look at this.
The unanimous decision of this court.
It says unanimous. You see that? Thank God. So that means there's not any goofballs in there. No goofballs.
Woman and sex in the Equality Act.
Let me dial this back.
That the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
Yes.
But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and harassment in substance in their acquired gender.
So you can see, right? And this is, I mean, like, all that makes sense, right? You can't harass them, but they're also not the same as a biological woman. I feel like that's a pretty reasonable thing to think. I think everybody thinks that pretty much. Don't go around harassing somebody, but that doesn't mean that you've got to go and act like they're the same thing as a biological woman, right? And so that's it. And anyway, it's perfectly reasonable. It is. It's perfectly reasonable. Huge win for common sense. LOL, what? The UK did that? Surprise. Yeah, I know. It's a great thing, a rare bit of good news from the UK, and before a Supreme Court is arrested for that offense. And women-only services, so like there's a lot of services, like for example, like female-only prisons, housing for abused women. So the fact is that these services exist because of the intrinsic nature they have of being segregated. Like, again, there's a reason why you have female-only prisons. There's a reason why there is housing that is just for abused women. And, like, that's it. And you might not think that's fair because it's discrimination, but everybody that knows that it makes sense, right? Everybody, like, you gotta be out of, that's me, not you, sorry. You gotta be out of your fucking mind to think that it's not. And so, anyway, you saw that Chinese are fleeing China right now? No, I'll look at that later on. But problem is they consider not thinking them as biological women as harassment. Well, they're not biological women. It's just a fucking fact. Like, you might not like to hear that if you're a trans person or whatever. And I can see how for you it would suck because, like, you want to be seen as this other type of person and you want people to like you, etc. But the fact is that if you're trans, it is not the same thing as being a biological female. And everybody knows this. Literally everyone fucking knows this. The only reason why anybody pretends like they don't is because they're afraid of getting canceled. Everybody fucking knows this. And so anyway, too bad. Yeah, exactly. And so that's really what I think more than anything. What about straight males? Are we getting anything? Well, I mean, no. This is for women-only prisons because in a lot of cases, straight males are the ones that beat them. Like, men and women both initiate domestic violence often, but, I mean, like, if you're getting in a fight with a bear, it doesn't really matter if you start the fight or the bear starts the fight. The bear's going to win the fight. And so that's really the reason why. It's like women are in a disadvantageous position, right? Like, that's it. And like, yeah, you're lying? Really? So you getting your ass beat up by women all the time? Damn, that sucks, bro. Like, you a bitch. Damn. So do y'all know we got a pussy in chat? We got a pussy ass bitch in chat. What is going to get your ass beat up by a girl? You getting beat up by a girl, brother. What is wrong with you? Oh my God. Yeah, did you drop your gay card? What's going on about this? Shut up, man. Why, you being such a little bitch. Her name is Emma Frost. Well, if only I could be so lucky. But here's the thing. This is a great thing. I'll tell you that. And yeah, let's see here. I'll find the rest of it. Rarest UKW ever. And crazy this is coming from the UK. And it's just nuts. Huge one for women over there. I hope stuff like this continues to happen. It is going to happen. You deserve it's happening. Every news that I read is very violent revolt. It says like a new McDonald's just opened kind of news. I don't know about that. And in saying that women born as female is a statement that anyone has to clarify. I think that, again, the age of the mental illness SSRI Karens is waning. We are seeing the death throes of that age, and I can't wait to see it. It's amazing. Gender transition surgery is typically expensive. Odds are those who have fully transitioned don't require those services, or am I wrong? You're kind of wrong, and also people's financial situations can change pretty fast too, right? I mean, like you may have had a lot of money at 19, maybe you inherited money, but now you're 30 and you lost the money, or you lost your job or something. Like, I see what you're saying. I'm just not really, I'm not about it. So yeah, if a woman hits a man, is it okay for him to hit her back? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, unequivocally. Absolutely. Don't hit people. It's pretty simple. Yeah. Maybe after the third punch, I don't know. It depends, right? I mean, I think that everybody's going to make their own decision. Now, I can tell you something, right? I want to tell you a little story. It's a story about my friend named Jeff. My friend named Jeff was married to a stripper. It didn't go very well. So, he's downtown. Her name, I swear to God, was Angel. So, she goes, she fucking breaks like a glass on his head or something like that in 6th Street, right? Like, everybody's downtown, and she gets in an altercation with Jeff, and she like hits him or something like that. The cops get called. The cops show up. Now, just take a guess. Is it the stripper that is sitting in the cop car, or is it the former disabled veteran Jeff who's sitting in the cop car? Just take a guess who's in the cop car. It's Jeff. That's right. Big shock. You couldn't believe it, could you? And so anyway, if you want to hit a chick, the fact is the rules are against you, right? And so do so at your own, what do you call it? At your own peril. And try to, and this is the same with anything, right? I mean, it's never a good thing to be violent. And if you can ever avoid being violent, you should. But, you know, in the same way that I support self-defense, that doesn't mean that I always think that that's like the best option every single time. The best option is to just remove yourself from the situation as best you can, right? That's always what it is. And so, yeah, too many knights in shining armor. Yeah. What happened to Jeff, though? Nothing. He got out. Is fine. Like, everything was okay. Like, it's not a big deal. But, like, you know, it was the implication, right? That, like, he's now the one that needs to be restrained. I've had a lot of friends that have had shit like this happen, right? As I said, I grew up... a lot of my friends have... you know, like, as I said, like, everybody was, like, getting mad about Extra Emily, like, running that red light. And I was like... Like, so, you know, the people I grew up with, right? Very different culture. And so, like, I just didn't really see it as nothing. Yeah, it's nothing. And so you can kill people though? Well, I mean, you don't want to, right? But like, obviously, like at a certain point for self-defense, sure. But, you know, that's not a point you want to be at, because even if you kill somebody in self-defense, like you're probably going to have PTSD from that. You're going to be in court for the better part, if not more than a year. You are risking going to jail. Like you want that to be your last resort. Just like with the rules, right? Like personally, if you kill somebody in self-defense, I think W, right? Like good. But at the same time, like my idea, like you should not take my ideology and apply that in a lot of ways, because like I can say that, but you're the one that's going to have to show up to court, right? You're the one that's going to have to show up to court. You're going to have to pay the lawyers. You're going to have to deal with all this shit yourself. So like, it's easy for me to say that because I'm writing checks, you got to cash. So always think about what's in your best interest and think about how to resolve something in a way that's most beneficial for you. And so that's the way I see it. So more on fly. Yeah, anyway, so that's really it. And huge Karens won today. Yeah, but actual Karens. Yeah, actual Karens. And that's the thing. That's the whole thing. Like, and really it comes down to it. This is, yeah. Not everyone's built to have a corpse on their conscience. No doubt. But anyway, so yeah, this is a huge W for the UK. Backs the biological definition of a woman. Everybody knows this, but some people, no man can be a lesbian. I mean, I'm a lesbian. I don't know what you mean. Yeah, I'm only attracted to women. Like, yeah. So I mean, I don't know how you could say. I could literally look at me. I'm a lesbian. Who else is a lesbian here? Same, yeah, exactly, right? We all are. So, former Concord dev says that it was gut-wrenching to see our project fail, but urges players not to judge Marathon too soon. To call this game a failure before it's even out is wild to me. Really? Well, it wasn't wild with Concord. It was pretty fucking accurate. So, it's actually, like, I think that it's really funny how all of these developers and people want to act like it's not fucking obvious when a game is going to die. Like, I'm sorry, but like people were right about, okay, let's just make a list. Notepad. Okay. Games people were right about. Okay. Number 1, Concord. Concord number 2, Assassin's Creed. Shadows. Okay, there it is. Let me go back. I'm gonna just go ahead and space this out. There we go. And Veilguard, south of Midnight. Forspoken, Starfield, Avowed, Lost Records, Star Wars Outlaws, Dustborn. Like, I mean, nobody cared about that game to begin with, but like, sure, a Flintlock, Unknown 9, living up to its name. People don't even know what game that is. So how is it that gamers don't, like, how is it that every time that the internet of capital G gamers decides that a game is going to be garbage, it's garbage? Isn't that interesting? How every single time that one of these games comes out and people say it's going to be bad, it's bad every single time. Yeah. Do you have like a 100% success ratio, and the only game on this list is maybe Assassin's Creed Shadows, right? Maybe this one wasn't as big of a failure, but I think it was, especially considering what their projections, I'm assuming, were. Redfall, yes, look at this, Redfall. How many of these are there? Skull and Bones. It's just insane. I mean, Avengers. From Square Enix, just so people don't get it confused with, obviously, Marvel Rivals. It's Anthem. No, people didn't really have I don't remember what Anthem, like the dialogue was around that, so I don't know. Yeah, Saints Row. Here's the thing. We could keep going. Urges players to call this game a failure before it's out is wild to me. Well, welcome to the fucking jungle, bitch. There's precedent for this, And it sure seems like there's a 100% hit rate. I'm sorry. Really? What are we talking about? Let's take a look at the art. Let's see what they said. And so I replied to this. I said, some games deserve to be aborted. Concord is the reason why I'm pro-choice. Marathon looks okay, but the characters look over-designed and are not visually appealing. That's it. And so I didn't even read any of these comments or anything like that. A game with no dedicated campaign should be DOA. Base take Asmongold as usual. Everybody knows that. We're getting pre-banned from Marathon subreddit. I wonder if they'll ever listen to the main player base of these games. What is this here? To me, they look trans too, which is an instant turnoff. If you cannot immediately tell the gender of a character, put the character in the garbage and try again. That's my opinion. If you can't immediately tell. Now, there are, like, I can think of one exception. I thought this was a girl. I did. I thought I had to play as a girl. But it turns out it wasn't a girl, but I was like, bro, it might be a girl. But it's a femboy, which is okay, right? Because but it's a JRPG. So you've got like a special set of rules, okay? But anyway, former Concord dev says it was gut-wrenching for us to see our project fail, but urges players not to judge Marathon too soon. To call this game a failure before it's even out is wild to me. It's wild to you. Well, hey, let's go ahead. This is like an investor in Enron, SBF. No, what's the company that he did? I forgot even what the company was called. It's like, this is like you've invested in Enron, Theranos, FTX, and like this is like an investor who's telling you, wait a minute, guys, no, this one's not a scam. Come on. Yeah, it's insane. Yeah, but Bernie Madoff. Yeah, exactly. And pick on it. Yes. A gameplay of Bungie's extraction shooter was excitement for is non-negligible number of gamers who have jumped into the conversation to make unflattering comparisons to Concord. Spurred by these reactions, a former Concord developer is taken to Reddit. Let's take a look at the Reddit post. Hey all, former Firewalk Studios dev here. I've been a long-time lurker for many years and I rarely post anything. But after reading the comments about Marathon being Concord 2.0 on Reddit, YouTube, and Twitch, I just wanted to share a little insight into what a 40-year-old man is feeling after dedicating a large portion to his life for making video games. For the past, he dedicated the last 7 years of his life to comedy, but other than that, yeah, maybe he made another game before that as well. For the past 17 years, I've been part of some great projects, I've worked on some talented people. Many players knew about Concord and what happened with the project. Concord failed to inspire players, and the messages was heard loud and clear. Well, apparently not by Bungie. It was gut-wrenching to watch our project fail and be the laughingstock of many online. Well, yeah, I bet it was. Listen, we all know this, but I'll say it again. I am the most empathetic streamer. So I can understand the way he would feel. I bet it sucked. I do. I bet it sucked to have everybody making fun of you. I could easily see that. It makes a lot of sense. Most humble? Yeah, but I'm not talking about that right now. I can't bring it up all the time because, I am, I'm kind of like, just how it is. What the fuck are these studios doing? I don't know. But anyway, so I can see that. I understand it. I have learned that failure is what drives me to succeed. Well, then why are you driving Bungie to fail? No one feels as bad as the people who put their time on the line hoping that it will entertain the masses of gamers around the globe. I'm not asking for pity or even sympathy because after all, the name of the game, you win or lose, the margin of success is very thin. I took a chance and I lost. You didn't take a chance. You did not take a chance. You didn't listen to what gamers wanted. You actively went against it. You pushed narratives in games that didn't resonate with your core audience. You did this knowingly. If you ask this guy, who the fuck do you think your audience is? And if he thinks that it's this modern audience type of thing, no, you didn't take a chance. Bro, it's insane. Like, this isn't a chance. You just decided to lose. Us gamers are tired of this? Well, gamers have risen up. The prophecy has been fulfilled. The idols are being destroyed. and a new world is being made anew. The Concords of yesterday are history. Yeah, the beacons are lit. The beacons have been lit, okay? People are tired of this shit. And some of you probably smell blood in the water. Yes. And you probably want to roast me for no longer lurking and exposing myself. No, you made a shitty game. You made a mistake. It's okay. Mistakes happen. Learn from it. That's what everybody makes mistakes. I don't want to roast this guy massively. A little bit I do. But massively, I'm not trying to roast this guy. Mistakes happen. You fucked up. But man, you really fucked up, didn't you? And the worst part about you fucking up is you don't even understand how you fucked up. That's the problem. It's what I said earlier. If you can't figure out why you failed, you can never succeed. Because you can never reverse engineer why it is that things didn't go right. Why did you put ugly fat women in the game? What were you thinking? Are you retarded? Nobody wants to be that. Ugly fat women don't want to be that. That's why they use anime profile pictures instead of their face. It's not even a question. Well, what are we talking about? This is ridiculous. How is this even a conversation? But you can't say that. You can't say that. And you can't say that because you're still complicit in a lie. I hope you don't. Most people don't create these projects and work very hard to be the next big thing. Seeing the faces of the developers' Bungie stream gave me hope and excitement for what's to come on Marathon. I commend them for taking a chance and trying something foreign to them that isn't proven nor guaranteed to succeed. Yes, because Bungie has never made a futuristic fantasy shooter with laser guns and different planets. This is actually the first game like that they've ever made. So it's a new horizon for them. You know, anything goes, right? Yeah, who knows? Anyway, it takes a lot of courage. TLDR, I worked on Concord and I did my best. We came out short. Please don't punish others for our mistakes. We're not punishing others for your mistakes. We're recognizing the pattern. We're all human beings who are trying to create something special. Well, then do a better job. Marathon is no different. Be kind and cool as video games are meant to be fun. You recognize how nothing that this person did was address any of the criticism that people had or talk about why it was wrong or not wrong. And the reason why is because in the games industry, this problem is the emperor's new clothes. Everybody knows that people don't want characters that look like this and designs that are in this type of perspective or narratives like this put in the game. But nobody in the development community, nobody in the gaming audience, or sorry, the gaming professional space can address this because it's career suicide. And I want to promise you that if you can't address this, it will be career suicide because gamers will kill your game. Every single time. And here's the list. You want to join the graveyard? Then talk around the problem.